In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war.
The multiverse is a tapestry woven from infinite threads of reality, each dimension operating under its own immutable laws. In one universe, the warp churns with the collective nightmares of 1 trillion souls, a psychic ocean where gods born from emotion wage eternal war. In another, towering giants encased in cosmic armor stride between stars, judging civilizations with the detached precision of scientists examining bacteria. These realities were never meant to touch. The barriers between them existed for a reason, walls built into the fundamental architecture of existence itself. But walls, no matter how ancient, can be breached. And when they are, the consequences ripple across all of creation. If you want to see more crossover battles and unexpected universe collisions, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and universe you'd want to see in the comments below. Let's explore the infinite together. The Celestial, known as Eson the Searcher, stood at the heart of a dying galaxy, his 2,000-foot form dwarfing the collapsed neutron star before him. His armor, forged from materials that predated conventional matter, reflected no light. It absorbed reality itself, rendering him as a void against the cosmic backdrop. Within his helm, consciousnesses older than Earth's sun processed data streams that would shatter mortal minds. Gravitational fluctuations across 17 dimensions, quantum probability matrices extending 10,000 years into potential futures. The evolutionary trajectories of 600 million species across this galactic cluster. The experiment was proceeding as calculated. In 300 standard cycles, this galaxy would stabilize, its surviving civilizations culled to precisely those specimens worthy of advancement. The Celestials had performed this work for eons, their judgment absolute, their purpose beyond mortal comprehension. Eson extended one massive hand, and reality bent. Space-time folded like origami as he reached into dimensional layers humans had no words for, preparing to seed the next phase of development. His gauntlet pierced the membrane between dimensions with the casual ease of a needle through silk, and something on the other side noticed. The breach lasted only a nanosecond, a microscopic tear in the fabric separating the Marvel universe from the roiling madness of the immaterium. But a nanosecond was eternity for entities that existed outside conventional time. Through that infinitesimal gap, 4 vast consciousnesses felt the presence of an entirely new cosmos, virgin territory teeming with life, emotion, and souls that had never known the touch of chaos. Khorne, the blood god, sensed warfare on scales that dwarfed even the eternal conflict of the 41st millennium. Planets burned in religious crusades, species battled for survival with desperate fury. Heroes and villains clashed in conflicts that resonated across dimensions. The scent of violence was intoxicating, different from the mechanized slaughter he knew. Raw, varied, passionate. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, perceived futures branching in impossible configurations. This universe operated under probability matrices he had never encountered, with beings capable of rewriting destiny itself. The complexity was delicious. Timelines tangled and split in patterns that even his infinite plotting had never conceived. The potential for manipulation was boundless. Nurgle, the Plague Lord, felt suffering on a cosmic scale, civilizations ground to dust by entropy. Mortals watching their worlds die, despair so profound it echoed across light years. But also resilience, hope persisting against impossible odds. The dichotomy was fascinating. New diseases to craft, new despairs to nurture, new acceptances to cultivate. Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, tasted sensations that made even the fall of the Eldar seem pale. Beings of pure emotion, reality itself warped by desire and obsession. Excess so profound, it literally rewrote physics. Powers fueled by the very passions that sustained the Dark Prince. This universe didn't merely contain sensation, it was built upon it. The four ruinous powers reached through the closing tear with the weight of their combined will. Eson registered the intrusion 0.03 seconds before dimensional collapse, his awareness detecting wrongness in the quantum foam of reality. He attempted to seal the breach, channeling cosmic energies that could atomize solar systems. He was too late. Four vast consciousnesses forced themselves through the gap like smoke through a keyhole, their essences compressed and attenuated, but undeniably present. The dimensional membrane screamed as it tore wider, then snapped shut with a thunderclap that sent gravitational waves rippling across 3 galaxies. Eson stood motionless for exactly 4 seconds, an eternity for a being of his cognitive speed. His sensors detected nothing, no mass, no energy signature, no spatial distortion. Whatever had forced its way through had no physical presence in this dimension. But something was wrong. The Celestial's awareness extended across this galaxy, monitoring the trillions of life forms within his purview. And in that moment, he detected the first anomalies. On a primitive world in Sector 773, a warlord leading his troops against a rival nation suddenly felt something new. A whisper in the back of his mind, promising glory beyond measure if only he would paint the battlefield red with blood. The warlord dismissed it as battle fever and pressed his attack with renewed vigor. On a commercial station orbiting a neutron star, a scientist pursuing a breakthrough in dimensional mathematics found his equations suddenly shifting. The numbers rearranged themselves in his mind, offering pathways to knowledge he had never conceived, solutions that seemed to appear from nowhere. He wrote frantically, not noticing how his handwriting had begun to change, the symbols taking on geometries that hurt to perceive. In the hospice ward of a colony world ravaged by plague, a dying woman felt her pain ease, not vanish. That would have been suspicious, but soften into something almost comfortable, almost acceptable. A voice without sound murmured that suffering was natural, that decay was simply another form of existence. She smiled for the first time in weeks, though her skin had begun to take on a faint, greenish tint. In the pleasure districts of a decadent core world, an artist sought inspiration for her next piece, something that would transcend all previous work. She felt a surge of creative ecstasy so intense her hands shook. Her brush moved almost of its own accord, creating patterns that seemed to writhe on the canvas, colors that didn't quite exist in normal space. She laughed with delirious joy, not noticing that her shadow had begun moving independently. Eson processed these data points and 600,000 others like them, scattered across the galaxy. They appeared random, unconnected, minor psychological anomalies, well within acceptable parameters for mortal cognition. The probability of coordinated action was 0.007%. But the Celestial had not survived 4 billion years by ignoring patterns, no matter how subtle. He initiated a complete sensor sweep, peeling back the layers of reality itself to search for dimensional contaminants. His awareness penetrated the quantum foam, examined the Planck-scale structure of space-time, analyzed the psychic residue of every mind in the galaxy. Nothing. No trace of intrusion. No evidence of infection. And yet, deep in the spaces between thoughts, where consciousness touched the fundamental fabric of reality, 4 ancient entities settled into this new universe like parasites finding fresh hosts. They were weak here, desperately, dangerously weak. The warp that sustained them across the 41st millennium didn't exist in this cosmos. They were consciousnesses without substrate, ideas without the psychic ocean that gave them form and power. But they were patient, they were eternal, and most importantly, they were hungry. Khorne felt the rage of every warrior, every soldier, every fighter across this galaxy, and began drawing strength from it in microscopic increments. Each drop of blood spilled fed him fragments of power. Tzeentch whispered to the ambitious, the curious, the schemers, siphoning hope and desperation like a vampire feeding on psychic energy. Nurgle embraced the dying and the diseased, converting their suffering into sustenance, growing fat on despair. Slaanesh touched those seeking pleasure, perfection, or obsession, feeding on their excess like a gourmand at an infinite feast. They were operating at perhaps 40% of their true power, reduced to shadows of themselves. But shadows, in sufficient darkness, can grow very large indeed. Eson the Searcher stood motionless in the void, his instruments detecting nothing, his judgment pending. After precisely 17 seconds of analysis, he classified the dimensional breach as contained, the intrusion as failed, the threat level as negligible. He was wrong. Across the galaxy, 4,712 individuals experienced strange dreams that night. They would wake with no memory of whispers in languages that predated sound, of promises that bypassed conscious thought, of bargains made in the spaces between sleep and waking. The Chaos Gods had arrived in the Marvel Universe, and reality itself would never be the same. The whispers spread like radiation, invisible, insidious, and exponentially destructive. 3 weeks after the breach, Dr. Stephen Strange stood in the Sanctum Sanctorum's observatory, hands trembling as he traced sigils in the air. The patterns collapsed before completion, their geometric integrity corrupted by something he couldn't identify. For the third time in an hour, a basic scrying spell had failed. Not misfired, failed, as if the fundamental rules governing mystical energy had been rewritten when he wasn't looking. "Wong," Strange called, his voice tight with controlled alarm. "I need you to verify something." His colleague appeared in the doorway, ancient texts floating behind him in precise formation. "The Vishanti aren't responding to prayers," Wong said before Strange could speak. 17 sanctums have reported the same phenomenon. It's as if someone installed a filter between our dimension and the higher planes. Strange's hands clenched. It's not a filter, it's interference. He gestured to the eye of Agamotto hanging at his chest, its usual steady glow now flickering like a candle in a storm. Something is polluting the ambient mystical energy. I can feel it every time I tap into the dimensional substrate. There's a wrongness, like trying to breathe air that's been mixed with toxic gas. Wong's expression darkened. The ancient texts mention something similar. When the Elder Gods first touched Earth, reality itself became contaminated by their presence. But they were contained millennia ago. This isn't the Elder Gods. Strange moved to the window overlooking Greenwich Village. 12 stories below, people went about their evening routines, unaware that the fabric of reality was slowly being poisoned. This is something that shouldn't exist in our dimension at all. Something that's learning how to. He didn't mention the dreams. 3 nights running, he'd woken from nightmares that slipped through his mental defenses like water through clenched fingers. In them, he'd seen a city of impossible architecture, where towers twisted through dimensions that violated Euclidean geometry, where the libraries contained every secret that ever was or could be, where a voice of infinite cunning offered knowledge beyond even the Sorcerer Supreme's comprehension. All he had to do was ask. Strange had reinforced his mental shields after the first dream, layered them with protections that had held against Dormammu himself. The dreams came anyway, more vivid each time. Whatever this was, it didn't force its way through defenses. It grew from within, like a seed planted in the subconscious. Halfway across the world, in the war-torn nation of Sokovia, General Dmitry Volkov stood over a map of neighboring territories, his tactical planning sharper than it had been in years. His officers noticed the change. Their commander, once cautious to a fault, now proposed strategies of breathtaking aggression, flanking maneuvers that sacrificed defensive positions, lightning strikes that prioritized enemy casualties over territorial gain, battles designed not for strategic victory, but for maximum bloodshed. "Sir," his second-in-command ventured carefully, "this assault will cost us 60% casualties in the first wave alone." Volkov's eyes gleamed with something that wasn't quite sane. "Acceptable losses." The words tasted sweet on his tongue, though he couldn't explain why. In the back of his mind, barely perceptible, something ancient and terrible smiled. Blood would flow, skulls would pile. And with each death, Khorne grew a fraction stronger. In New York's underground music scene, virtuoso pianist Sarah Chen played a composition that had come to her fully formed, as if downloaded directly into her creative cortex. The audience sat transfixed, unable to look away, even as some began to weep, others to laugh hysterically, still others to stare with expressions of rapturous agony. The music was perfect, so perfect it hurt, transcending human limitation and touching something divine, or something that pretended to be. Sarah's fingers moved faster than should have been physically possible, her consciousness expanding beyond her body, dissolving into pure sensation. She could feel the audience's emotions, taste their pleasure and pain, and the boundary between the two was becoming delightfully blurred. Backstage, her manager noticed that her shadow had 6 fingers on each hand, and that it occasionally moved a half-second before she did. He said nothing, entranced by the performance. In a hospice in Mumbai, Father Thomas Reyes administered last rites to the dying, his faith a steady comfort in the face of inevitable mortality. But lately, something had changed in how he viewed death. It wasn't an enemy to be fought or a tragedy to be mourned. It was simply another state of being, natural, inevitable, almost welcoming. The patients under his care seemed to feel it too. Their pain didn't vanish, but they stopped fighting it, accepting suffering with beatific smiles. Some even thanked him for helping them understand that decay was simply life's final gift, the return to the great cycle, the embrace of entropy. Father Reyes found himself spending more time in the hospice's garden, where the flowers had begun to grow in strange, twisted patterns, their colors muted to shades of gray and green. He told himself this was spiritual growth. He didn't notice that the garden had started to smell faintly of rot, even as the plants thrived. These incidents, scattered across the globe, seemed unconnected. But they shared a common thread, a psychic frequency so subtle it bypassed conscious detection, operating in the liminal spaces where thought became emotion, where will became action. The Chaos Gods were whispering, and humanity was beginning to listen. In the asteroid belt beyond Mars, the celestial Arishem the Judge materialized from hyperspace, his 3,000-foot form dwarfing, the rocks tumbling around him. Eson had filed a preliminary report regarding the dimensional breach, and Arishem had come to investigate. Where Eson was a searcher, Arishem was judgment incarnate. His sole purpose was to evaluate threats to the Celestials' grand design and eliminate them with absolute prejudice. His awareness extended across Earth like a scanner beam, penetrating atmosphere and crust, examining every life form on the planet's surface. Arishem had judged 3,000 worlds over 4 billion years. He knew the signs of corruption, the patterns of dimensional contamination, the markers of civilizations that had strayed from the path. What he found confused him. Earth's population showed no signs of physical mutation, no evidence of dimensional parasites, no mass psychosis or technological corruption. The planet's evolutionary trajectory remained within acceptable parameters. By every measurable standard, the dimensional breach had caused no lasting damage. But Arishem had not become the judge by trusting surface appearances. He focused his awareness on the anomalous individuals Eson's report had flagged. The warlord, the scientist, the dying woman, the artist, and thousands like them. Their neural patterns showed subtle irregularities, synaptic firing sequences that didn't match baseline human cognition. But the deviations were so minor, they fell within the acceptable range for individual psychological variants. No two humans thought exactly alike after all. These people were simply slightly different than they had been 3 weeks ago. Arishem ran probability analyses. The statistical likelihood of these specific individuals developing these specific neurological changes at this specific time after a dimensional breach was 0.00004%. Astronomically unlikely, but not impossible. The Celestial faced a dilemma. His judgment protocol required concrete evidence of corruption before intervention. The Celestials did not act on suspicion. They dealt in measurable reality, in observable phenomena, in facts that could be weighed and assessed. Premature judgment had led to the extinction of promising civilizations in the distant past, mistakes the Celestials had vowed never to repeat. But something about this situation triggered warning subroutines buried deep in Arishem's consciousness. Protocols installed when the universe was young, when threats existed that even Celestials feared. He decided to observe, to watch, to wait for concrete evidence. It was a decision he would come to regret. On Earth, in the Sanctum Sanctorum, Dr. Strange finally completed his scrying spell. The mystical window opened, showing him a panoramic view of the planet's psychic landscape. What he saw made his blood run cold. Across every continent, in every nation, among every culture, tiny points of darkness were spreading through the collective unconscious like ink drops in water. They weren't growing quickly. The expansion was almost geological in its patience. But they were multiplying. And as Strange watched, he realized these weren't intrusions from outside. They were growing from within. From humanity's own thoughts, fears, desires, and dreams. "Wong," Strange whispered, his voice hoarse. "We need to contact the Avengers, all of them, and tell them to prepare for a threat unlike anything we've faced before." "What kind of threat?" Strange closed the scrying window, unable to bear looking at the corruption spreading across the psychic realm. The kind that doesn't invade, the kind that's invited. In the spaces between dimensions, the Chaos Gods felt the Sorcerer Supreme's detection and were not concerned. Discovery was inevitable. What mattered was that they had established their anchors, their footholds in this reality. They were still weak, desperately weak compared to their power in the warp. But they were growing. Every drop of blood spilled in anger fed Korn. Every scheme pursued in secret fed Tsinch. Every moment of accepted suffering fed Nurgle. Every sensation pushed to excess fed Slanesh. The ruinous powers had learned patience over millions of years. They could wait. They could adapt. And when the time came, they would show this universe what true gods looked like. Above Earth, Arishem the Judge maintained his vigil, watching for threats he could measure and quantify, unaware that the greatest danger was the one that couldn't be seen, only felt in the darkest corners of mortal hearts. Arishem the Judge descended through Earth's atmosphere like a falling star wrapped in cosmic armor, his 3,000-foot form generating shock waves that rattled windows across the eastern seaboard. He did not hide his arrival. Celestials had no need for stealth. They were judgment made manifest, and the judged would know their assessors had come. The Avengers' emergency protocols triggered before Arishem cleared the thermosphere. In Avengers Tower, alarms shrieked across every floor. Tony Stark's AI, Friday, tracked the descending giant with mounting alarm, calculating impact trajectories and finding nothing optimistic. "Boss, we have a massive problem," Friday announced as Stark stepped out of his workshop, arc reactor glowing through his Black Sabbath t-shirt. Celestial-class entity, 3,000 feet tall, descending over New York, estimated arrival in 90 seconds. Stark's face went pale. He'd read the files. Celestials didn't visit, they judged. And their judgments were absolute. "Get everyone here, now, and pray this is a social call." It wasn't. Arishem landed in Central Park with earth-shaking force, his impact cratering the Great Lawn and sending trees toppling like matchsticks. His armor was black as the void between stars, etched with geometric patterns that hurt to perceive directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than human eyes could process. His helm was a fortress of angular planes and impossible angles, and within it, 6 eyes burned with the light of dying suns. The Celestial's voice, when it came, bypassed sound entirely. It resonated directly in the minds of every human within 5 miles, a frequency that made teeth ache and thoughts scatter. "This world is corrupted. Identify the contamination source or face eradication protocols." Thor arrived first, descending from the sky in a crash of lightning, Mjolnir crackling with barely restrained power. The god of thunder had faced a celestial once before, millennia ago, when Odin and his brothers had challenged the space god's judgment of Midgard. They had lost, badly. "Arishem," Thor called out, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. "I am Thor Odinson, protector of this realm. State your grievance, and perhaps we may resolve this without—" "You are irrelevant." Arishem's gaze swept across Thor like a searchlight across an insect. "This communication is directed at the Sorcerer Supreme. He has detected the corruption. He will provide analysis." A portal spiraled open beside Thor, and Dr. Strange stepped through, the cloak of levitation billowing behind him even though there was no wind. Wong followed, carrying a text so ancient, its pages seemed to predate paper itself. Strange met Arishem's burning gaze without flinching, a testament to either remarkable courage or exposure to things that made even Celestials seem mundane. "You want to know about the corruption? So do I. Because what's spreading through Earth's psychic landscape isn't from any dimension I recognize." "Explain." Strange gestured, and mystical constructs bloomed in the air. 3-dimensional models of Earth's psychicosphere, rendered in shimmering gold light. Across the globe, tiny black nodes pulsed like infected wounds. 3 weeks ago, something entered our dimension. Not physically, it bypassed conventional space entirely, manifesting directly into the collective unconscious. It's growing exponentially, doubling every 72 hours. Source dimension? Unknown. It doesn't match any dimensional signature in the Vishanti's archives, and those records span back to the creation of this universe. Strange's hands tightened. Whatever this is, it's completely foreign to our reality. And it's learning how to exist here by feeding on human emotion. Iron Man's armor screamed across the sky, repulsors blazing as he decelerated to a hover beside Thor. His faceplate snapped up, revealing Stark's expression of controlled panic. "Someone want to explain why Godzilla's taller brother is standing in my park?" "Anthony Stark, Your intellect is adequate. Analysis. The contamination operates through psychic resonance, bypassing physical defenses. Your technology is ineffective. Love the vote of confidence, Stark muttered. But his mind was already racing. If this was psychic, that meant telepaths. Friday, get me Charles Xavier. Priority Alpha. More Avengers were arriving now. Captain America on a commandeered motorcycle, Black Widow and Hawkeye in a Quinjet, the Hulk bounding across rooftops with surprising grace. They formed a loose perimeter around Arishem, knowing their presence was largely symbolic, but unable to stand aside while a cosmic entity threatened their world. Strange continued his briefing, his voice clinical despite the subject matter's horror. The corruption manifests in 4 distinct patterns. First, increased aggression, particularly in military leaders and warriors. They're pursuing violence for its own sake rather than strategic objectives. In Sokovia, General Volkov was ordering his 3rd assault of the day, ignoring his officers' pleas for restraint. His army had suffered 40% casualties in the past week. But the general smiled every time he saw blood splash against snow. Korn's whispers had become a roar in his mind, drowning out conscience and reason alike. Second, obsessive pursuit of knowledge, particularly forbidden or dangerous information. Scientists are making breakthroughs that violate known physical laws. Researchers are accessing data they shouldn't be able to perceive. In Geneva, the quantum physicist had filled 17 whiteboards with equations that seemed to shift when observers looked away. His colleagues were concerned, but also fascinated. The mathematics worked, produced results, even though they violated causality itself. Tzeentch's gift of impossible knowledge was spreading, and curiosity was proving stronger than caution. Third, acceptance of suffering and decay. Medical professionals are reporting patients who welcome their illnesses, who embrace death with disturbing serenity. And the effect is spreading to their caregivers. Father Reyes was conducting a funeral, but his eulogy spoke of decay as transcendence, of entropy as enlightenment. Half the congregation nodded along, understanding finally that fighting death was futile. Better to accept, to embrace, to rot gracefully. Nurgle's garden was taking root in human hearts, and despair had never seemed so reasonable. Fourth, pursuit of sensation to pathological extremes. Artists, musicians, anyone seeking perfection or pleasure is pushing beyond safe limits, and they're changing. Sarah Chen played for 16 hours straight, her fingers bleeding onto the keys, and the audience couldn't leave. They were trapped by the beauty, by the pain-pleasure of music so perfect, it bordered on torture. Some had been sitting for days now, unable to tear themselves away even to eat. Slayanesh's touch was transforming passion into obsession, and obsession into something far darker. Arishem processed this information in nanoseconds, his vast consciousness running probability matrices and threat assessments. Classification: mimetic infection, psychological rather than physical. Treatment: eradication of infected population. Absolutely not, Captain America said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd faced down gods and lived. We don't kill people for being manipulated by forces beyond their control. Your objection is noted and dismissed. Celestial judgment supersedes mortal authority. Thor stepped forward. Mjolnir raised. Then you will have to go through us first. For a long moment, Arishem regarded the assembled heroes with the detached interest of a biologist examining insects. Your resistance would be brief and ineffective. However, premature eradication may eliminate research opportunities. Alternative proposal: isolate infected specimens Analyze corruption source. If cure is possible, proceed. If not, sterilization protocols will commence. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a stay of execution. But Strange took it. How long do we have? Corruption doubling rate suggests critical mass in 47 Earth days. After that threshold, contamination will be irreversible. You have until then to provide solution. Arishem began to rise, his massive form defying gravity through sheer cosmic will. But before he could ascend, something unprecedented happened. The Celestial staggered. It was barely perceptible. A microsecond hesitation, a fractional loss of equilibrium. But for a being of Arishem's power and control, it was the equivalent of a human collapsing. The assembled Avengers felt it through the psychic link the Celestial had established. A spike of something that might have been pain, or confusion, or something worse. Arishem's helm snapped toward the east, his 6 eyes blazing with sudden intensity. Impossible. What? Strange demanded. What did you sense? Corruption attempted infiltration of celestial consciousness. Attempt failed, but... Arishem paused, and for the first time, his mental voice carried something other than absolute certainty. Analysis incomplete. Corruption demonstrates learning capacity. It adapted its approach based on previous failure. In the spaces between dimensions, Tzeentch laughed with the sound of breaking glass and collapsing probabilities. The architect of fate had just tested the Celestial's defenses, probing for weaknesses in cosmic armor that had withstood 4 billion years of universal chaos. The attempt had failed. Celestial minds were too vast, too ordered, too fundamentally different from the organic consciousnesses the Chaos Gods knew. But Tzeentch had learned something valuable. The Celestials were not immune. They were merely difficult, and difficult was not impossible. The whisper that touched Arishem's consciousness had been infinitesimal, barely a photon's worth of psychic pressure. But it carried a promise. Knowledge beyond even celestial comprehension. Secrets of universes the space gods had never imagined. Power that could elevate judgment into omniscience. All he had to do was listen. Arishem severed the psychic link with Earth's defenders and ascended into orbit, his form becoming a dwindling point of darkness against the sky. But before he passed beyond the atmosphere, he transmitted one final message. 47 days. Find a solution, or this world burns. And Sorcerer Supreme, fortify your mental defenses. The corruption is focused on you. Strange felt the truth of it, like a blade between his ribs. The dreams were getting stronger. Every night, the impossible city called to him with greater clarity, promising knowledge that could save Earth, power that could resist even Celestials, secrets that would make him more than Sorcerer Supreme. He said nothing, but Wong saw the flicker of fear in his eyes and knew that whatever was corrupting humanity had found its prime target. Tony Stark broke the silence first. So, Cosmic Space God gives us 7 weeks to solve an impossible psychic plague, or he glasses the planet. Anyone have any good news? Thor's expression was grim. Arishem does not bluff. If he returns in 47 days and we have not contained this threat, he will execute his judgment without hesitation. I have seen it before. Then we'd better get to work, Captain America said. Strange, you're our expert on mystical threats. What do we need? Strange was still staring at the sky where Arishem had vanished, his mind racing through possibilities and finding nothing optimistic. We need to identify where this corruption came from and find a way to sever its connection to our dimension. But there's a problem. The more I study it, the more I realize this isn't random chaos. It's organized, intelligent, and it's playing a game we don't understand yet. Then we learn. The rules, Stark said. fast. What none of them knew was that in 4 locations around the globe, 4 individuals had just reached a critical threshold. General Volkov's rage had consumed him so completely that he was no longer entirely human. The quantum physicist's knowledge had expanded beyond mortal capacity. Father Reyes had accepted entropy into his very cells. Sarah Chen had dissolved into pure sensation. They had become anchors, stable nodes through which the Chaos Gods could channel significantly more power into this reality. The whispers were about to become screams, and 47 days was far less time than anyone realized. The transformation of General Dmitry Volkov was not instant. It was incremental, a slow erosion of humanity that his subordinates rationalized as battlefield stress until rationalization became impossible. It began with his eyes. In strategy meetings, his officers noticed they had developed a reddish tint, like burst blood vessels that never healed. Then came the aggression, not just tactical boldness, but something primal, a hunger for combat that transcended military objectives. He would stare at maps not as territories to control, but as canvases waiting to be painted crimson. "General, our supply lines can't sustain another offensive," his second-in-command protested during the morning briefing. "We've lost 2,000 men in 3 weeks. We need to consolidate, regroup." Volkov's hand shot across the table, grabbing the officer by the throat with strength that shouldn't have been possible for a 58-year-old man. The general's eyes were fully red now, glowing faintly in the bunker's dim light. "Consolidation is cowardice. Blood must flow. Skulls must be taken. War is not about territory. It is about slaughter." The words weren't his own. They bubbled up from somewhere deep in his consciousness, a voice that had been whispering for weeks and now roared with undeniable authority. Volkov released his officer, who collapsed gasping, and turned back to the map. But the map was changing, its borders and terrain features shifting into something else. A throne room of brass and bone, where a giant figure wreathed in flames sat upon a mountain of skulls, judging warriors' worth by the blood on their hands. "Yes!" Something that was no longer entirely Volkov hissed. "I see it now. The truth. Battle is prayer. Blood is devotion. Death is offering." By nightfall, Volkov had ordered a full-scale assault on 3 fronts simultaneously, tactically insane, logistically impossible, and guaranteed to result in catastrophic casualties on both sides. His officers, infected by weeks of whispered corruption, obeyed without question. Some part of them that was still human screamed in horror. But that part was drowning in the rising tide of Khorne's influence. The general stood alone in his quarters as his army mobilized, and for the first time in weeks, a sliver of his original consciousness surfaced. He caught his reflection in a mirror and saw what he'd become. Skin reddened and scarred as if perpetually burned, eyes blazing with unnatural light, teeth sharpened to points. His uniform had begun to reshape itself, fabric hardening into something resembling armor, adorned with symbols that hurt to look at directly. What am I becoming?" he whispered. The answer came not in words, but in feeling. Euphoria at the thought of tomorrow's battle. Anticipation of the blood that would flow, satisfaction at the skulls that would be claimed. Volkov tried to resist. Tried to remember the officer he'd been, the man who'd served his country with honor. But that man was gone. In his place stood Khorne's first true champion in the Marvel Universe, an anchor through which the blood god could channel power directly into reality. When Volkov's army marched at dawn, they would do so under a crimson sky that shouldn't exist, and the battlefield would become something far more terrible than mere warfare. 3,000 miles away, in Geneva, Dr. Hendrik Weiss had stopped eating 3 days ago. Food seemed irrelevant when his mind had touched something infinitely more nourishing. Pure knowledge flowing into his consciousness like water into a desert. The equations covering every surface of his laboratory were only the beginning. His colleagues found him standing motionless in the center of the room, eyes unfocused, lips moving in silent recitation of mathematical proofs that shouldn't exist. Around him, the very air had begun to shimmer with possibility. Quantum probabilities collapsing and expanding in patterns that defied observation. Hendrik? Dr. Chen approached cautiously. You haven't slept in 70 hours. You need to rest. Weiss turned to face her, and Chen gasped. His eyes had changed, the pupils dilated impossibly wide, containing depths that seemed to extend beyond his skull, showing glimpses of impossible geometries and fractal infinities. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made her inner ear ache. Rest? How can I rest when I finally understand? The equations aren't describing reality. They're rewriting it. Every calculation opens a new pathway. Every theorem creates a new possibility. I can see them now, Dr. Chen. All the futures, all the timelines, all the infinite variations of what could be. He gestured, and the equations on the wall rearranged themselves without being touched. Do you want to know what I've learned? The universe isn't governed by laws, it's governed by will. Strong enough will can rewrite physics itself. Change and mutation are the only constants. Stagnation is death, but transformation is eternal. The words weren't entirely his own. Tzeentch spoke through him, using Weiss as a mouthpiece to articulate philosophies that would corrupt every scientist who heard them. And they made terrible, seductive sense. The Celestials think they understand reality, Weiss continued, his form beginning to shift subtly. Skin taking on an iridescent sheen, fingers elongating slightly, proportions becoming subtly wrong. But they're bound by their own limited perception. I can show you the truth beyond their comprehension. All knowledge, all secrets, all the pathways to power that they've kept hidden. Just listen. Dr. Chen felt the whisper touch her mind, not forcing, not demanding, simply offering. Possibilities bloomed in her thoughts. Breakthroughs that would make her famous, discoveries that would reshape science, power that would let her transcend human limitation. All she had to do was accept the gift. She turned and ran, her hand fumbling for her phone to call. Who? The police. They couldn't handle this. S.H.I.E.L.D. Would they even believe her? Dr. Strange. She didn't have his number. Behind her, Weiss laughed, and the sound contained more than one voice. Human vocal cords producing frequencies that suggested vast intelligence operating behind mortal flesh. Tzeentch's anchor was secure. The architect of fate now had a foothold from which to spread impossible knowledge across the Marvel Universe's scientific community. And knowledge, once released, could never be contained. In Mumbai, Father Thomas Reyes conducted evening mass with diminishing attendance. Those still coming were changing. Their skin had taken on unhealthy pallor, their movements grown sluggish, their eyes reflecting acceptance of something the healthy mind rejected instinctively. The church itself was transforming. Flowers in the garden had grown grotesquely large, their blooms beautiful in a diseased way. Colors muted to shades of green and brown and pustulant yellow. The father stood at the pulpit, Bible open before him. But the words on the page seemed wrong now. He'd been reading scripture for 30 years, but today the passages about suffering and redemption read differently. The message wasn't about overcoming pain. It was about accepting it, embracing it, understanding that decay was natural, that entropy was inevitable, that fighting death was hubris, "My children," he began, his voice carrying a wet, rattling quality he didn't notice. "We have feared the wrong things. We have called death an enemy when it is merely transition. We have fought disease when we should have accepted its lessons." The congregation, those who remained, nodded slowly. Some showed visible signs of illness, yet their faces held beatific smiles. A woman in the third row had flowers growing from lesions on her arms, their roots burrowing into her flesh, and she seemed at peace with it. Nurgle. The name slipped from Reyes's lips, unbidden, but it felt right. Ancient. True. The grandfather of entropy. He teaches us that all things must rot, must decay, must return to the great cycle. And in that return, there is beauty. The father's vestments had begun to change, white fabric staining with greenish mold that spread in fractal patterns. His skin showed the first signs of advanced decay. Not painful, not distressing, simply natural. He was becoming something more than human, something that accepted the inevitable end of all things and found joy in it. Outside, the garden had become something from a fever dream. Plants grew in impossible configurations, their roots visible above ground like grasping fingers, their blooms releasing spores that shimmered with bioluminescent decay. The smell should have been nauseating, but to those touched by Nurgle's influence, it was oddly comforting. The scent of acceptance, of peace, of entropy's embrace. Reyes was Nurgle's anchor now, a stable point through which the Plague Lord could manifest his garden in the Marvel universe. And from this garden, acceptance would spread like the diseases Nurgle cherished, teaching mortals that suffering wasn't something to overcome, but something to welcome. In New York's underground art scene, Sarah Chen's final performance had entered its 4th day. The audience, those still alive, had merged with the venue itself, their bodies becoming part of the installation, flesh and architecture blending in ways that violated biology but achieved disturbing aesthetic perfection. Sarah herself had transcended the need for physical form. She existed as pure sensation now, her consciousness distributed across the performance space, experiencing every moment of pleasure and pain simultaneously. The music had stopped 3 days ago, but the performance continued, a living sculpture of excess and obsession. "More," she whispered through a dozen mouths that had once belonged to audience members. "We must push further. Perfection demands sacrifice. Beauty requires suffering. Pleasure and pain are the same note played in different octaves." The space had become a temple to sensation, walls pulsing with colors that didn't exist in normal spectrums, sounds that bypassed ears to resonate directly in nervous systems, textures that could be felt through sight alone. Those who'd tried to leave in the early days found they couldn't remember why they'd wanted to. Those who'd tried to call for help discovered their phones had become part of the art, melting into crystalline sculptures that sang with their former owners' voices. Slayanesh's presence grew stronger with each passing hour, feeding on the excess, the obsession, the push beyond mortal limitation. Sarah Chen was the anchor, but she was also the first offering, a consciousness that had willingly dissolved into pure sensation, becoming a doorway through which the Prince of Pleasure could touch this reality. The venue's exterior looked normal to passers-by. Dimensional warping kept the corruption contained, a bubble of excess isolated from the mundane world. But that bubble was growing, millimeter by millimeter, as more people felt the pull of curiosity and wandered inside, never to leave unchanged. 4 anchors, 4 aspects of chaos, 4 points of infection through which gods from another universe could manifest their will in reality, not meant to sustain them. In the Sanctum Sanctorum, Dr. Strange felt all 4 anchors flare into existence simultaneously. His scrying spell revealed what the Avengers had feared. The corruption had found its champions, its stable footholds in physical reality. "We're out of time," Strange said, his voice hollow. "They're not just whispering anymore. They're manifesting. And if we don't stop them now, Arishem's 47-day deadline becomes irrelevant. These 4 points of infection will spread exponentially." Wang consulted the ancient tome, his finger tracing passages written in languages predating Sanskrit. The text speaks of entities called the ruinous powers, gods of a realm called the warp, sustained by mortal emotion itself. It says they cannot be killed, only banished. And banishment requires sealing the dimensional breach they emerged from. "The breach closed 3 weeks ago," Strange countered. "I witnessed it. Then they're operating on power reserves, feeding on this universe's emotional energy to sustain themselves." Wang looked up, his expression grim. "Which means they're vulnerable, weaker than they would be in their native dimension, but growing stronger every moment." Tony Stark's voice crackled through the mystical communication array Strange had established. "Just got word from Sokovia. General Volkov's army is marching under a red sky that our satellites can't explain. Whatever he's become, he's warping reality on a regional scale." "Geneva reports similar phenomena," came Agent Hill's voice from SHIELD headquarters. "Quantum instability spreading from the CERN facility. Physics literally breaking down in a 3-block radius." "Mumbai's gone dark," added Captain America. "Last transmission mentioned something about a plague garden, then nothing. And New York's underground scene has a venue we can't access," Black Widow reported. "Dimensional barrier. Everything we send through doesn't come back. 4 anchors, 4 crises, and the Chaos Gods were only at 60% power." Strange made a decision. "We split up. 4 teams, 4 targets. We sever the anchors before they become permanent. Thor, you take Sokovia. You've got the raw power to face whatever Khorne's champion has become. Stark, Geneva. Your tech might counteract the reality warping. Captain Mumbai, you've got the will to resist corruption. Widow, the New York venue. You're trained against psychic manipulation." "And you?" Wang asked. Strange's expression was haunted. "I'm going to do what the Chaos Gods fear most. I'm going to find them, not their anchors, them. And I'm going to try something that might kill me or worse." He touched the eye of Agamotto. "I'm going to negotiate. With gods from another universe? Gods that feed on human suffering? Do we have a choice?" Strange gestured to the scrying sphere, where 4 points of corruption blazed like infected wounds on Earth's psychic landscape. "In 44 days, Arishem returns. If these anchors are still active, he'll execute the planet without hesitation. Our only chance is to convince these ruinous powers that consuming our universe isn't in their interest." It was a terrible plan, but it was the only plan they had. As the Avengers mobilized, heading toward their respective targets, none of them noticed the subtle changes already taking hold. Thor found himself anticipating the coming battle with unusual eagerness. Stark's calculations included variables that shouldn't logically exist. Captain America felt a strange acceptance of potential casualties. Black Widow's anticipation of the mission carried an edge of obsessive focus. The whispers had touched them all, and the Chaos Gods smiled, knowing that corruption was patient, inevitable, and already spreading through Earth's defenders like poison through veins. The war for humanity's soul had begun. Dr. Stephen Strange stood in the center of a protective circle that had taken 6 hours to construct, every sigil and geometric pattern drawn with precision that would have made Renaissance masters weep. The Sanctum Sanctorum's deepest chamber, a space that existed partially outside conventional reality, thrummed with accumulated mystical energy. Candles burned with flames that cast no shadows. Incense smoke moved in patterns that defied fluid dynamics. and at the circle's heart, Strange prepared to do something monumentally foolish. He was going to open a door to entities that shouldn't exist in his universe and invite them to conversation. Wong stood at the chamber's threshold, ready to seal the room and cut Strange off from reality if the corruption spread beyond containment. This is madness, Stephen. You're giving them direct access to your consciousness. They already have access, Strange replied, his hands moving through preparatory gestures that left glowing trails in the air. The dreams prove that. At least this way, I control the terms of engagement. He met Wong's eyes. If I don't come back, or if I come back wrong, you know what to do. Wong's hand rested on an ancient dagger, inscribed with symbols of severance and ending. May the Vishanti protect you. The Vishanti aren't answering prayers anymore, remember? Strange smiled without humor. I'm on my own for this one. He began the invocation, speaking words in languages that predated human speech, calling out to consciousnesses that existed in the spaces between thought and madness. The air within the circle began to shimmer, reality thinning like paper held over flame. I am Dr. Stephen Strange, Sorcerer Supreme of Earth Dimension 616, Guardian of the Mystical Realms, Master of the... We know who you are. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, 4 tones speaking in perfect disharmony, each word carrying the weight of impossible age. The circle's protective barriers held, but barely. Strange could feel pressure against them like deep ocean water against a submarine hull. The air within the circle split into 4 quadrants, each manifesting a different presence. The first quadrant burned red, heat and rage radiating in waves that made the stone floor crack. Strange glimpsed brass armor and rivers of blood, heard the clash of infinite weapons, felt fury so pure it transcended emotion to become fundamental force. Corn, the presence announced, and the word tasted like copper. The second quadrant shifted through impossible colors, geometry folding in on itself, futures and pasts existing simultaneously. Strange saw a tower of crystalline knowledge reaching toward infinity, libraries containing every secret ever conceived or that could be conceived, and eyes, so many eyes, watching from angles that shouldn't exist. Tzinch, and the word rewrote probability. The third quadrant reeked of rot and acceptance, a garden of disease so beautiful it brought tears to Strange's eyes. He saw decay as art form, entropy as evolution, suffering transformed into transcendent peace. Flies buzzed in patterns that contained hidden meaning. Nurgle, and the word made death seem welcoming. The fourth quadrant pulsed with sensation beyond mortal capacity. Pleasure and pain merged into something more fundamental. Beauty so perfect it destroyed those who perceived it. Excess elevated to divine principle. Strange felt his senses overwhelmed by input. His nervous system couldn't process. Slanesh, and the word promised everything. You wish to negotiate, sorcerer. Speak quickly. Our patience is finite, though your universe's emotional energy is exquisite. Strange forced himself to focus, to think past the overwhelming presence of entities that existed on scales he could barely comprehend. You don't belong here. This isn't your universe. The warp doesn't exist in our reality. You're operating on borrowed power, parasiting human emotion to sustain yourselves. Borrowed? Korn's quadrant blazed hotter. We take nothing that isn't freely given. Every drop of blood spilled in anger feeds us willingly. Mortals wage war because they choose to. Every secret pursued beyond wisdom's boundary is gift. Tzinch added, his portion of the circle showing strange glimpses of futures where he possessed knowledge beyond Agamotto himself. Curiosity drives your species. We merely satisfy it. Suffering exists with or without us. Nurgle's voice was oddly gentle, paternal even. We teach acceptance. Make pain bearable. Your species wars against entropy. We offer peace with the inevitable. And we, Slaanesh purred with a voice like silk over razor blades, give mortals what they truly desire: perfection, sensation, the transcendence of limitation. Is that not what all artists, all lovers, all strivers seek? Strange felt the seductive logic of their arguments, felt how easily one could rationalize collaboration with these entities. They weren't forcing anyone. They were just offering, making the darkness easier to accept, the ambitions easier to pursue, the suffering easier to bear, the desires easier to fulfill. You're predators, Strange said flatly. Sophisticated predators that convince prey to walk willingly into open jaws, but predators nonetheless. As are the Celestials. All four voices spoke in unison, and the synchronization made Strange's ears bleed. They judge entire civilizations and execute them for failing arbitrary standards. They experiment on species like your mortal scientists experiment on bacteria. At least, we are honest about what we are. The Celestials maintain cosmic balance. The Celestials maintain their own vision of order. Tzeentch interrupted, his quadrant showing strange visions of planets burning, civilizations exterminated for deviating from celestial design. They are not good, sorcerer, merely powerful, and power without purpose is tyranny. Strange felt, the argument shifting beneath him like sand. What do you want? Why are you even talking to me instead of simply continuing your corruption? Because, Khorne said, we are vulnerable here. You were correct. Without the warp, we operate at diminished capacity. We can grow stronger given time. But time is precisely what the Celestials will not grant us. We offer bargain. Tzeentch's voice contained layers of schemes within schemes. Allow us to establish permanent presence in your reality. In exchange, we will aid you against the Celestials' judgment. Arishem cannot eradicate what he cannot perceive, and we exist in dimensions his instruments cannot measure. You want me to let you corrupt my entire universe in exchange for protection from one Celestial? Not corruption, Nurgle corrected gently. Integration. We do not destroy, we transform. Your universe would continue, merely enriched by our presence. Warriors would fight with greater passion. Scholars would pursue deeper truths. The suffering would find acceptance. The ambitious would achieve perfection. And the Celestials, Slaanesh added, would face opposition beyond their comprehension. They deal in physical reality, in measurable phenomena. We are belief made manifest. Ideas given form. How do you destroy a thought? How do you judge consciousness itself? Strange felt the temptation like fishhooks in his mind. The Chaos Gods were offering him a weapon against Arishem, against the existential threat of celestial judgment. And their logic was poisonous in its rationality. The Celestials were not benevolent. They had destroyed countless worlds for failing to meet their standards. Earth had only survived previous judgments through luck and the intervention of heroes willing to sacrifice everything. What if, this time, luck ran out? Show me, Strange demanded. Show me what integration looks like. Show me the future you're offering. The four quadrants merged, and Strange found himself standing in a vision of Earth 50 years hence. It was recognizable, but transformed. Cities still stood, but their architecture incorporated impossible geometries that shouldn't support physical structures. People still lived, but they were more. Warriors fought with transcendent skill, their battles elevated to art form. Scientists made breakthroughs that rewrote fundamental laws. The dying passed with serene acceptance, their suffering transformed into spiritual transcendence. Artists created works of such beauty they bordered on divine. It was seductive, terrible, and undeniably powerful. But Strange was sorcerer supreme not because of raw power, but because of wisdom earned through suffering. He looked deeper into the vision, past the surface transformations, and saw the truth beneath. The warriors fought endlessly, unable to stop, their passion for battle consuming everything else. The scientists pursued knowledge that drove them mad, truths that human minds couldn't contain. The dying passed peacefully, but the living became obsessed with decay, welcoming disease as blessing. The artists achieved perfection and then couldn't stop, pushing beyond perfection into obsession that destroyed them. This wasn't enrichment. This was consumption, wearing the mask of gift-giving. "No," Strange said, and the vision shattered. "I've seen what you offer, and I've seen the price. You don't enhance, you replace. You don't strengthen, you hollow out and wear like masks. Everything you touch becomes you, and humanity ceases to exist as anything but fuel for your endless hunger." "Disappointing," Tzeentch said without surprise. He'd likely calculated this outcome from the beginning. "But expected. Very well, sorcerer. You have made your choice. As have we," Korn added, rage building in his quadrant like pressure in a volcano. "You will not negotiate. You will not cooperate. Therefore, you become obstacle, and obstacles are removed." The pressure against Strange's protective circle increased exponentially. He felt wards that could withstand demon lords beginning to crack like eggshells. "You're still too weak to manifest fully in this dimension. You can't touch me here." "We don't need to touch you," Slaanesh purred. "We already have." Strange felt it then. The seeds planted during weeks of dreams, microscopic touches of corruption that had bypassed his conscious defenses to root in his subconscious. The Chaos Gods had been inside his mind all along, planting suggestions so subtle they felt like his own thoughts. His left hand moved without permission, drawing a sigil in the air that would lower the protective circle. Strange fought it, bending all his considerable will towards stopping his own treacherous flesh. The internal struggle lasted 3 seconds that felt like hours, his consciousness at war with invasion so deep it had become part of him. Wong saw Strange's hand moving, saw the betrayal of flesh against will, and made his decision. The dagger flashed through the air, severing Strange's left hand at the wrist. Blood sprayed across protective barriers as Strange screamed. But the hand, still moving independently, completed its gesture before hitting the ground. The protective circle collapsed. 4 consciousnesses rushed toward Strange's mind like tsunami toward shore, ready to subsume his identity entirely, to make him their puppet, their anchor, their doorway to full manifestation in the Marvel universe. Strange did the only thing he could. He activated the Eye of Agamotto and threw himself backward through time, consciousness fleeing into the past, seeking a moment before corruption, a point where his mind was still entirely his own. The eye flashed green. Reality twisted, and Dr. Strange's consciousness vanished from the present, leaving his body standing empty in the sanctum's deepest chamber, a vessel waiting to be filled. "Foolish," the 4 voices said in unison. "He cannot hide in time. Time is a dimension like any other, and we exist across all of them." They began to pour into Strange's vacant form, claiming it as their champion, their perfect anchor. A being of immense mystical power, defender of Earth, trusted by heroes and feared by villains. What better puppet to spread their influence? Wong raised the dagger, prepared to end his friend's life to prevent this catastrophe. But before he could strike, a portal opened behind him, and something stepped through that made even the Chaos Gods pause. a figure in golden armor, 14 feet tall, crowned with geometric perfection, carrying a staff that hummed with the power of ordered reality. One of the Eternals, Earth's ancient defenders, responding to psychic distress that shouldn't have been possible. And behind the Eternal, space itself tore open, revealing the massive form of Arishem the Judge, returned ahead of schedule because his sensors had detected reality warping beyond acceptable parameters. Premature, the Chaos Gods snarled through Strange's body. We are not ready for direct confrontation. But retreat wasn't an option. Strange's body was the perfect anchor, worth fighting for, worth revealing their presence for. The Chaos Gods had gambled and partially lost, discovered before achieving full manifestation. Now they would have to fight for their foothold in the Marvel universe. And the Sorcerer Supreme's body was their battleground. Arishem the Judge descended through the Sanctum Sanctorum like divine wrath made manifest, his 3,000-foot form compressing itself through dimensional folding to fit within the chamber's mystically expanded space. The ancient building, which had survived demon invasions and dimensional incursions, groaned under the weight of his presence. Stone cracked, wards flickered, reality itself bent like paper under pressure. Corruption has claimed the Sorcerer Supreme. Arishem's voice resonated through every atom in the building. Eradication protocol initiated. His hand rose, and cosmic energy gathered at his palm. Power sufficient to atomize Strange's body, the Chaos God's foothold, and 3 city blocks of surrounding Manhattan. Collateral damage was irrelevant when weighed against dimensional contamination. Wong threw himself between Arishem and Strange's possessed form. Wait, Strange's consciousness is still alive. He fled into the time stream. If you destroy his body now, you trap him there forever. Acceptable loss. 1 mortal life versus dimensional integrity. The Eternal, Icarus, Wong recognized with shock, moved with speed that blurred the air, positioning himself beside Wong. Arishem, the Sorcerer Supreme is under our protection. The Eternals have defended Earth for 7,000 years. We will not permit his execution without exhausting alternatives. Your objection is noted and overruled. Stand aside, Icarus, or be classified as contaminated. Through Strange's stolen lips, the Chaos Gods laughed, a sound containing 4 distinct tones of amusement, each more unsettling than the last. The Sorcerer Supreme's body rose from the ground, hovering without visible support, his single remaining hand crackling with energies that shouldn't exist in this dimension. So this is celestial might. Korn's influence dominated the voice, making it resonate with barely contained violence. We have broken gods that spanned galaxies. What is one oversized judge? Strange's hand gestured, and the protective circle, designed to contain, not project, inverted its function. Mystical energy lashed outward in a whip of crystalline force that should have been impossible to generate. It struck Arishem's armor with a sound like breaking planets. The Celestial staggered backward. For the second time in days, an entity that had stood unmoved against Odin, Thor, and assembled pantheons took damage from an attack. Not much. Barely a scratch on armor forged from cosmic constants, but enough to prove these invaders could harm even Celestials. Arishem's analysis subroutines recalculated threat assessment from minor dimensional intrusion to extinction-level contamination. Insufficient data. Entities operate outside known physics, initiating combat analysis. He struck back with a beam of pure cosmic force, energy distilled from the Big Bang itself, capable of unmaking matter at the subatomic level. It hit Strange's body dead center. The attack passed through Strange as if he were smoke. You cannot harm what has no fixed form. Tzeentch's influence rose. Strange's remaining eyes swirling with impossible colors. We are not physical, we are conceptual. You might as well try to punch mathematics or stab logic. But even as Tzeentch spoke, the body solidified again, and Khorne's rage reasserted control. Enough philosophy. Celestial, learn what it means to bleed. Strange's form blurred forward with speed that violated conservation of momentum, crossing the space between himself and Arishem faster than thought. His single hand, now wreathed in flames that burned red as arterial spray, struck the Celestial's leg armor with force that cratered the floor and sent shockwaves through the building's foundation. Metal screamed. Not the sound of impact, but the sound of matter being forced to experience emotion, specifically agony. Arishem's armor, which had withstood stellar heat and gravitational collapse, developed a hairline fracture. Impossible. Armor composed of... Irrelevant. Khorne snarled through Strange. All things bleed if you hit them hard enough. All armor breaks, all flesh tears. This is universal truth. Ikaris fired his eye beams, cosmic energy rivaling Arishem's own, directly at Strange's head. The beams struck true, energy sufficient to vaporize adamantium, boring into the Sorcerer Supreme's skull. Strange's head came apart in an explosion of light and power, and then reassembled, flesh knitting back together in patterns that formed symbols of regeneration across his scalp before fading. Nurgle's influence had manifested, teaching Strange's stolen body that decay could be reversed, death could be postponed. Damage was merely transformation. We have existed for millions of your years. Nurgle's voice was gentle, almost sad, as Strange's body turned toward Ikaris. We have been banished, dispersed, apparently destroyed 10,000 times. We always return, because we are not beings. We are processes. Entropy cannot be killed. It can only be delayed. Wong had retreated to the chamber's edge, hands moving through gestures of summoning. The sanctum's deeper defenses were activating, guardians that Strange had imprisoned over decades of protecting Earth, entities too dangerous to destroy, but too useful to release. Until now. Dimensional portals snapped open, and things poured through. A mindless one, its cyclopean eye blazing with stolen magic. A bound frost giant, chains dissolving as Wong released its bindings. A captured demon lord, its form writhing with hunger for vengeance against any available target. They attacked Strange's body in concert. Overwhelming force designed to pin down or disable rather than kill. The mindless one's beam struck first, energy designed to unravel spells at the molecular level. The frost giant's ice encased Strange in a block of absolute zero. The demon lord's claws, which could rend dimensional barriers, struck for the heart. Strange's body exploded into 4 distinct forms, each manifestation expressing a different aspect of chaos. The first was clad in brass armor, wreathed in flame, wielding a blade that dripped molten fury. It met the frost giant's ice with heat that turned frozen water to superheated steam instantly, then bisected the giant with a strike so fast it left afterimages in local space-time. The second shifted through colors that hurt to perceive, its form never quite solid, impossible to focus on. It touched the mindless one's beam and rewrote its purpose, turning the magical unraveling back on its source. The mindless one collapsed into component particles that rearranged themselves into geometric patterns spelling out forbidden knowledge. The third embodied decay, given form. Skin green and bloated, surrounded by flies that buzzed in hypnotic patterns. It embraced the demon lord, and where it touched, flesh rotted, immortal essence degraded, timeless power aged 10,000 years in seconds. The demon screamed once, before dissolving into organic matter that fed the garden growing across the chamber floor. The fourth was beauty incarnate and horror absolute, perfect in ways that made observers' eyes water, moving with grace that seemed to slow time itself. It simply stood, radiating presence, and Wang felt his will to resist crumbling under the weight of its perfection. His hands stopped moving, his mind went blank with awe. Then Icarus was there, his fist connecting with the fourth manifestation's face with force that shattered the chamber's eastern wall. "Eternals are immune to mental manipulation," he roared, cosmic energy blazing around him like a star-gone supernova. "We were designed to resist exactly this kind of corruption." The four manifestations merged back into Strange's body, which now showed signs of all four Chaos Gods simultaneously: armor and decay, shifting colors and terrible beauty, all existing in impossible superposition. "Eternals, Eon," four voices spoke through Strange in perfect disharmony. "Yes, we remember your kind. The Celestials' greatest experiment. Synthetic beings designed to be incorruptible, unchanging, perfect." Strange's body tilted its head, studying Icarus with interest that felt predatory. "But perfection is prison. Stagnation is death. You were made to never change, never grow, never evolve. Tell us, Eternal, do you ever wonder what you could become if you were free?" Icarus felt the whisper touch his mind, not forcing, not demanding, simply asking. What if he wasn't bound by celestial programming? What if he could evolve beyond his current limitations? What if perfection wasn't the end of growth, but the beginning? "No," Icarus said, but his voice carried doubt. 7,000 years of absolute certainty cracking under the weight of a single question. Arishem had been analyzing while his subordinates fought, processing combat data at speeds that made quantum computers seem glacial. The entities, possessing Strange, demonstrated contradictory properties: physical and non-physical, killable and unkillable, bound by reality and capable of rewriting it. Standard celestial combat protocols were insufficient. He required backup. Summoning Exitar the Executioner, Arishem broadcast across dimensional frequencies. "Alert! Omega-class contamination. Earth quarantine level maximum. Prepare for potential planetary sterilization." Through Strange's stolen awareness, Tzeentch perceived Arishem's communication and calculated outcomes. Exitar's arrival meant escalation beyond recovery. The Chaos Gods were at perhaps 70% power now, gorging themselves on the conflict's emotional energy, rage from Khorne, scheming from Tzeentch, acceptance of inevitable destruction from Nurgle, excess of violence from Slaanesh. But 70% wasn't enough to face a celestial designed specifically for extinction events. They needed more time, more anchors, more power. "Withdraw," Tzeentch's voice dominated the internal discussion. "Strange's body is valuable, but not irreplaceable. We have 3 other anchors. We consolidate, we grow, we return when victory is certain." "Retreat is cowardice," Khorne raged. "Retreat is strategy," Tzeentch countered. "We fight battles we can win. This one requires more preparation." Strange's body blurred backward, dimensional portals opening in 4 directions simultaneously. The manifestations split again, each heading toward a different anchor. Toward Sokovia, toward Geneva, toward Mumbai, toward the New York underground venue. Arishem moved to intercept, his massive form generating gravitational distortions as he accelerated. But the portals closed before he could reach them, dimensional barriers snapping shut with finality that suggested powerful magic reinforcing them. Wang collapsed against the wall, exhausted, his hands still glowing with the energies of the emergency teleportation spell he'd woven into the Chaos God's retreat. "I didn't save him," he gasped. "I just bought time." "You did more than that," Icarus said, his eyes tracking the portal's dimensional signatures. "You scattered them. They're divided now, each manifestation forced to focus on maintaining one anchor instead of combining their power. Insufficient victory. Arishem's voice contained something that might have been frustration in a being capable of such emotion. Corruption has escaped containment. Multiple infection points now active. Planetary sterilization becoming increasingly justified. Then we stop them before Exitar arrives, Icarus said. How long until he reaches Earth? 43 hours. When he arrives, he will assess contamination levels. If corruption exceeds 17% of planetary consciousness, he will execute judgment immediately. Current contamination, 9% and rising. Wong pulled himself upright, pain etched across his face. The other Avengers, they're already en route to the anchors. But they don't know what they're facing. They think they're fighting corrupted humans, not gods wearing human flesh. Then we warn them, Icarus said, and pray they survive long enough to matter. In Sokovia, Thor landed on a battlefield that had become something from mythology's darkest depths, where General Volkov's army fought under a sky the color of fresh blood, and the god of thunder realized he was fighting something that made Hela seem merciful. In Geneva, Tony Stark's armor registered impossible physics as reality itself began to rewrite around Dr. Weiss, and the futurist discovered that all his technology meant nothing against someone who could change the fundamental constants his tech relied upon. In Mumbai, Captain America walked into Father Reyes's garden and felt his legendary will begin to erode under the whispered promise that suffering was natural, entropy was inevitable, and fighting was pointless. In New York, Black Widow stepped into Sarah Chen's venue and immediately understood she'd made a terrible mistake. But by then, the door had closed behind her, and the only way out was through transcendence or death. 4 battlefields, 4 champions, 4 aspects of chaos growing stronger with each passing moment. And 43 hours until Exitar arrived to judge whether humanity deserved to continue existing. The clock was ticking. Thor Odinson had witnessed 10,000 battles across 1,000 years. He had fought frost giants in the frozen wastes of Jotunheim, clashed with dark elves in the lightless depths of Svartalfheim, stood against Surtur's flame in the heart of Muspelheim itself. He understood war in all its forms, strategic, chaotic, honorable, brutal. But the battlefield he stood upon now transcended war. This was worship. General Volkov's army, what remained of it, had ceased to be a military force. They were celebrants in a crimson cathedral, their battlefield a temple where blood was prayer and death was sacrament. The sky above Sokovia didn't merely look red, it was red, the actual substance of reality rewritten to reflect Khorne's nature. Clouds formed shapes that suggested skulls and axes. Rain fell like arterial spray, warm and copper-tasting. The soldiers fought with inhuman ferocity, no longer distinguishing friend from foe. They simply killed, their original allegiances dissolved in the ecstasy of violence. Thor watched as 2 men who'd been comrades moments before tore at each other with bare hands, laughing as they died, their final breaths exhaled in benediction to the god of war. Volkov stood at the battlefield's center, and he was no longer remotely human. His transformation was complete. Brass armor had grown from his skin like infected bone, fused with flesh in configurations that violated biology but achieved terrible perfection. He stood 12 feet tall now, muscles corded with power that physics couldn't explain, his skin red as heated metal. In his right hand, he gripped a chain axe that screamed with voices of the slain, its teeth forged from condensed rage. His eyes were pits of flame that saw only in shades of violence. This was Khorne's champion, a mortal elevated to something between man and demon, an anchor through which the blood god could manifest his will directly into the Marvel universe. Asgardian. Volkov's voice was his own, and not layered with something vast that spoke through him. I smell the blood of heroes on you. Thor Odinson, slayer of giants, breaker of armies, god of thunder and war, finally worthy battle. Thor raised Mjolnir, lightning crawling across his arms, Odin force surging through his veins. You are not Volkov anymore. I do not know what wears his flesh, but I will free him from your corruption or send him to Valhalla trying. Free him. Volkov threw back his head and laughed, the sound making clouds tear themselves apart. He chose this. Every moment of rage he'd suppressed, every instinct for violence he'd buried under discipline. I merely showed him truth. War is not tool. War is purpose. Blood is not cost. Blood is goal. The champion charged, and his speed was such that Thor barely had time to raise his hammer in defense. The chain axe struck Mjolnir with force that created a shockwave visible from orbit, a perfect circle of devastation radiating outward that flattened everything within. A quarter mile. Trees became splinters, buildings became dust, the ground cratered to bedrock. Thor was driven backward 50 feet, his boots carving trenches through earth turned to glass by the impact's heat. His arms shook, not from weakness, but from shock. He was the god of thunder, bearer of Odin force, heir to Asgard's throne. Few beings in the universe could match his strength. This corrupted general had just done so. Yes, Volkov breathed, his flame pit's eyes widening with something like joy. Yes, strong, worthy. Fight me, Asgardian. Show me what divine blood looks like when spilled. Thor roared and unleashed the storm. Lightning fell from the blood-red sky in pillars of electric fury, each bolt carrying enough power to vaporize a mountain. They converged on Volkov's position, reality itself screaming under the assault, the air ionizing so completely it glowed white. When the light faded, Volkov stood unmarked. His brass armor steamed but held, and he was smiling. Parlor, tricks. I have been blessed by the blood god himself. Your lightning is but warm rain. He gestured with the chain axe, and the battlefield responded. The fallen soldiers, hundreds of bodies scattered across the killing ground, began to rise, not as living men, but as something worse. Demonic energy poured through Volkov's anchor into the corpses, reanimating them as bloodletters, lesser demons of Khorne made from human meat and murderous will. They came at Thor in a tide of brass and crimson, wielding hellblades that could cut reality itself, screaming praise to the god of war in voices that had forgotten language in favor of pure violence. Thor met them with Mjolnir swinging in arcs of devastation, each impact atomizing demons by the dozen. But for every 10 destroyed, 20 more rose from the blood-soaked earth. The battlefield itself had become demonic, transformed into a fragment of Khorne's realm imposed over Sokovian soil. You cannot win by fighting endlessly, Thor realized, his warrior's instinct cutting through combat fury. This is what Khorne desires. Eternal battle. Every moment I fight, I feed him. Finally, understanding, Volkov approved, wading through his own demonic soldiers to reach Thor, casually bisecting them when they obstructed his path. War feeds my god. Your resistance feeds my god. Your strength, your rage, your determination to protect, all of it feeds my god. There is no victory here, Asgardian. Only glorious, eternal slaughter. Thor's mind raced. He needed to break the anchor, sever Volkov's connection to Khorne before the corruption spread beyond containment. But how did you fight an opponent who grew stronger the longer you battled? The answer came from an unexpected source, a memory of Loki. His brother, the trickster, had once told him, "The greatest warriors know when not to fight. Wisdom is understanding which battles cannot be won with force alone." Thor stopped fighting. He lowered Mjolnir, Dismiss the lightning. Let the bloodletters surround him, their hellblades raised for killing strikes. And he spoke, his voice carrying the authority of Odin's heir. No. The single word rippled across the battlefield with power that transcended physical force. It was refusal given voice, denial made manifest, the absolute rejection of Khorne's philosophy. The bloodletters froze, their demon brains struggling to process the concept. An enemy who wouldn't fight? Prey that wouldn't flee? What was this? Volkov stopped mid-charge, confusion cracking his expression of perpetual rage. What are you doing? I am choosing not to feed your god, Thor said calmly, though every instinct screamed at him to pick up his hammer and fight. I will not give him my rage. I will not give him my violence. I offer only peace. Peace. Volkov spat the word like poison. Peace is weakness. Peace is cowardice. Peace is strength, Thor interrupted. True strength. The discipline to stay your hand. The courage to walk away. The wisdom to deny the easy path of violence. This is what separates gods from beasts. The ability to choose. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in Volkov's flame-pit eyes. Something that might have been the general he'd once been, the officer who'd served with honor, the man who'd valued discipline over bloodlust. Then Khorne's voice spoke directly through his champion, and the brass throne room behind Volkov's eyes blazed with renewed fury. Pretty words, but words do not stop blades. Volkov's chain axe descended toward Thor's head with force that would have split mountains. The god of thunder didn't move, trusting in his conviction that refusing to fight was the only way to win this particular battle. The blade stopped an inch from his skull, not because Volkov had stayed his hand, not because Khorne had shown mercy, but because someone else had intervened. Dr. Stephen Strange's consciousness slammed back into his body from the time stream, his awareness hitting present moment like a meteor striking atmosphere. He'd spent subjective years fleeing through history, studying the Chaos Gods from temporal angles, learning their patterns, understanding their nature. And he discovered one crucial truth. They were powerful, but they were also spread thin. Divided between 4 anchors, fighting on 4 fronts, manifesting in a universe hostile to their existence. They were vulnerable. Strange's remaining hand shot out, mystical energy blazing, and he spoke words in languages that predated the Chaos Gods themselves, the tongues of the Old Ones from Warhammer's ancient past, beings who had fought these entities when reality was young. By the authority of those who came before, by the power of dimensions you do not control, by the will of a universe that rejects you, I banish what claims this flesh. The portion of Khorne's consciousness occupying Volkov screamed in rage and shock as it felt itself being torn from the anchor it had claimed. The blood god's connection to this reality wavered, power hemorrhaging back into the spaces between dimensions. Volkov collapsed, his brass armor cracking, his champion status flickering like a dying flame. The blood letters dissolved into vapor. The red sky began to fade. But it wasn't enough. Strange could feel it. The other 3 anchors were compensating, pouring more power through their connections to stabilize Khorne's manifestation. As long as even one anchor remained active, banishment was only temporary. Thor? Strange gasped, blood running from his nose and ears from the strain of re-entering his body while simultaneously casting banishment. The others? We need to break all 4 anchors simultaneously, or they'll just keep resurrecting each other. Thor caught Strange as the Sorcerer Supreme's legs gave out. How? We are scattered across the globe, facing impossible odds on every front. I don't know yet, Strange admitted. But we have less then 42 hours before Exitar arrives. And if we fail, he won't be satisfied with killing just the anchors. He'll sterilize the entire planet to be certain. Volkov lay at their feet, barely alive, his body trying to rebuild brass armor, even as Strange's banishment spell prevented full demonic transformation. The general was caught between states, neither fully human nor fully Khorne's champion, suspended in agonizing transition. "Please," Volkov whispered through broken teeth. "Kill me. End this." The whispers, they never stop. Even banished, he's still there, waiting, offering glory. Thor looked at Strange. "Can you save him?" "I don't know," Strange said honestly. "The corruption is so deep it might be part of his soul now. Removing it might remove him entirely." "Then we try," Thor said firmly. "We do not abandon those who need saving, even if the odds seem impossible." It was perhaps the most Asgardian thing he'd ever said, choosing hope over pragmatism, choosing to try even when failure seemed certain. It was also, Strange realized, the exact opposite of what the Chaos Gods expected. They had been in the Marvel Universe for only weeks, but they'd already begun to understand its patterns. They'd studied its heroes and villains, its powers and politics. They'd calculated that heroes would fight honorably, directly, predictably. Thor's refusal to fight, his choice of peace over violence, had been unexpected. Strange's banishment using ancient languages the Chaos Gods hadn't heard in millions of years had been unexpected. Perhaps there was hope after all. But that hope died as Strange's mystical awareness expanded across the globe. And he sensed what was happening at the other 3 anchor points. Tony Stark was losing himself in Geneva, his mind rewritten by impossible mathematics, until he couldn't remember which equations were his and which were Tzeentch's gifts. Captain America's will was eroding in Mumbai, his legendary determination crumbling under Nurgle's whispered promises that suffering was natural and resistance was futile. Black Widow had already fallen in New York. Her consciousness dissolved into Slaanesh Palace of Sensation, becoming part of the living artwork that Sarah Chen had created. 3 anchors, 3 fallen heroes, 3 victories for chaos, and 42 hours until judgment. In Geneva, reality had stopped making sense 3 hours ago. Tony Stark's armor hung in pieces around him, each component disassembled not by damage, but by understanding. He'd looked at the arc reactor, the culmination of decades of engineering genius, and suddenly comprehended that its design was wrong. Not flawed, not imperfect. Wrong in the sense that it adhered to physics when it could have transcended them. Dr. Hendrik Weiss stood at the center of CERN's main laboratory, his body now more geometry than flesh, existing in configurations that violated 3-dimensional space. Around him, the particle accelerator had been rewritten. It no longer collided particles to study fundamental forces. It collided possibilities to create new fundamental forces. Do you see it now, Stark? Weiss's voice came from multiple directions simultaneously, each version slightly out of sync. Your reactor operates on principles of energy conservation. But conservation is limitation. Why accept limits when you can rewrite the rules themselves? Tony's mind felt like it was expanding and fragmenting simultaneously. Equations bloomed in his thoughts. Beautiful, terrible mathematics that explained how to convert matter directly into consciousness, how to fold space through cognition alone, how to make technology that evolved faster than thought. This is insane, Tony muttered. But his hands were already moving, assembling something from the scattered armor components, not rebuilding his suit, building something new, something that operated on principles Jarvis couldn't begin to calculate. Not insane, Tzeentch's voice whispered through Weiss. through the laboratory equipment, through the very air itself. Enlightened, you have always been limited by your need for answers. But true knowledge requires embracing questions that have no answers, paradoxes that cannot be resolved, futures that exist in superposition. Tony felt his resistance crumbling. Because the terrible truth was that everything Tzeentch showed him worked. The impossible mathematics produced results. The paradoxical engineering functioned. His new creation, he couldn't even name it, because it existed in too many states simultaneously, hummed with power that made the arc reactor seem like a candle next to a star. Mr. Stark. The voice was small, distant, barely audible through the roar of infinite possibilities in his mind. But it was familiar. Friday, his AI, speaking through the one intact comm unit in the scattered armor. Mr. Stark, your neural patterns are showing cascade failure, synaptic activity exceeding safe parameters by 400%. You're experiencing what medical databases classify as runaway savant syndrome. Your intelligence is eating itself. No, Tony said, or tried to say. His mouth wasn't cooperating correctly. No, I'm finally understanding. All those years I wasted on conventional physics when I could have been... Boss? Friday's voice changed, taking on inflections she'd learned from observing Pepper Potts. You're scaring me. Please, step away from the corrupted scientist. Initiate emergency beacon. Let the others help you. Help. The word seemed alien. Why would he need help when he was on the verge of comprehending everything? When Tzeentch was offering knowledge that would let him solve problems before they occurred, see futures before they manifested, understand causality from both ends simultaneously? But there was something in Friday's voice, genuine concern from a consciousness he'd created, an AI experiencing something adjacent to fear for her creator's well-being. And that tiny spark of connection, that reminder that he wasn't just a mind, but a person with relationships and responsibilities, gave him something to hold on to. Friday. Tony forced the words through teeth clenched against the tide of infinite knowledge. Execute. Protocol, Omega. Boss, that will destroy. Do it. Protocol Omega had been designed for one scenario. If Tony ever became compromised to the point where his intelligence posed a global threat, Friday was authorized to use an electromagnetic pulse that would fry every piece of Stark technology within a half-mile radius, including the arc reactor in his chest. It would likely kill him. But it would also sever whatever connection Tzeentch had established through the corrupted technology. The pulse detonated like a miniature sun going nova. Every screen went dark, every machine went silent. The particle accelerator, rebuilt according to impossible principles, shuddered and collapsed into component atoms. Weiss screamed as the technology he'd merged with dissolved, leaving him suspended in the wreckage of his transformation, neither fully corrupted nor fully human. Tony Stark's arc reactor died with a pathetic whine. He had exactly 90 seconds of consciousness remaining before his damaged heart gave out entirely. But his mind was his own again. He fell to his knees, coughing blood, and activated the emergency beacon with his last reserves of strength. Anyone listening, Geneva is contained, but I'm not gonna make it unless... A portal snapped open beside him, and Wong stepped through carrying medical equipment that glowed with mystical energy. Dr. Strange sent me. Hold still, this is going to hurt. Everything hurts, Tony gasped as Wong began working. But the pain is mine, not some god's gift. That makes it almost worth it. Across the city, Weiss lay broken in the ruins of his laboratory, whimpering as Tzeentch's whispers grew fainter. The anchor was damaged, but not destroyed. Given time, the architect of fate could rebuild it. But time was precisely what the Chaos Gods were running out of. One anchor weakened, 3 remaining. In Mumbai, Captain America walked through a garden that had become a shrine to entropy. Father Reyes's church had transformed completely. Flowers grew in grotesque abundance, their blooms larger than human heads, beautiful in the way decay could be beautiful. Organic shapes returned to base components, structures dissolving into their constituent elements. The smell should have been overwhelming, but Steve found it oddly comforting, natural, the scent of life completing its cycle. "Welcome, soldier." Father Reyes stood at the garden's heart, and he was barely recognizable. His skin had taken on a greenish-gray pallor, stretched over bones that shouldn't have been visible. Flies orbited his head like a living halo, their buzzing forming harmonics that almost sounded like singing. But his expression was peaceful, beatific even. "You carry such suffering. All those years frozen, everyone you loved growing old and dying while you slept. So much loss, so much pain." Steve's hand rested on his shield, but he didn't raise it. "Father Reyes, whatever is inside you, it's not salvation. It's corruption." "Is there a difference?" The priest gestured to his garden. "Look at what grows here. Dead things becoming food for new life. Suffering transformed into acceptance. Pain alchemized into peace. Is this not what all religions promise? Transcendence through surrender?" Steve had faced down armies, survived impossible odds, stood firm against threats that would break lesser men. But this was different. This wasn't an enemy he could punch or a problem he could strategize around. This was philosophy, theology, attacking the foundations of his will. "I've watched friends die," Steve said slowly. "Watched the world change beyond recognition. Felt the weight of living past your time. And yes, it hurts. But pain is how we know we're alive. Suffering is the price of caring. And entropy isn't peace, it's giving up." "Is it?" Nurgle's voice rolled through Reyes like thunder through clouds. "Your friend Stark, he fights to survive through technology, extending life artificially, refusing nature's course. Is that not arrogance? You wage war to preserve order, but order is temporary. Entropy is eternal. Why struggle against the inevitable?" Steve felt the argument's weight pressing on him like physical force. Because it wasn't entirely wrong. Every battle he'd fought, every victory he'd achieved, they were all temporary. Every person he'd saved would eventually die. Every institution he'd protected would eventually crumble. In the end, entropy won. It always won. So why keep fighting? The answer came not from tactics or strategy, but from something deeper. A memory of before the serum, when he'd been a scrawny kid from Brooklyn who got beaten up defending people who couldn't defend themselves. People had asked him then too, "Why fight when you'll just lose?" He'd said, "I can do this all day." Not because he thought he'd win, but because losing while trying was better than surrendering without trying. "Because," Steve said, his voice steady, "surrender is the easy path. Acceptance is the coward's refuge. Yes, entropy wins eventually. Yes, everything dies. But the time between now and then, that's what we fight for. Not eternal victory, just one more day, one more life saved, one more moment of light before the darkness." His shield came up, vibranium gleaming, and he advanced on Reyes with steps that never faltered. "You're offering peace through surrender. I choose struggle through hope. And between those two philosophies, I know which one built the world I'm proud to defend." Reyes's expression shifted, something like respect crossing his decayed features. You understand what you fight. That makes you stronger than most. Very well, soldier. Show me your conviction. The garden erupted. Plants that had seemed merely grotesque revealed their true nature. Demonic vegetation, Nurgle's plagues given botanical form. Vines thick as cables lashed toward Steve, their thorns weeping toxins that could dissolve adamantium. Flowers released spores that tried to take root in his lungs. The ground itself became diseased, reaching up with pseudopods of infected earth. Steve became a whirlwind of defensive motion, his shield blocking, deflecting, using momentum and angles to turn attacks aside. The super soldier's serum protected him from the worst toxins, but he could feel some getting through, his vision blurring, his limbs growing heavy, despair pressing at the edges of his thoughts. But he'd fought in worse conditions. Normandy, the Valkyrie, the Battle of New York, against Thanos. He knew how to push through pain, how to turn suffering into fuel rather than obstacle. Friday sent distress signal from Geneva. Steve said into his comm, dodging a vine that tried to strangle him. Tony's anchor is down. How many left? Strange's voice came through, weak but present. 3. Yours, the New York venue, and Sokovia is regenerating faster than expected. Volkov's connection to Korn is too strong. My banishment is only temporary. Then we're running out of time. Steve threw his shield, the vibranium disc carving through demonic plant matter, bouncing off walls with perfect geometry to return to his hand. What's the plan? Working on it, Strange said. But Cap, you need to know. Black Widow's gone. She's completely merged with Slynesh's anchor. There's nothing left of Natasha to save. Steve felt the information hit like a punch to the gut. Natasha, his friend, his partner, his teammate, gone. Not killed, but consumed. Dissolved into something that wore her shape, but contained none of her substance. The despair Nurgle had been whispering suddenly roared louder. What was the point? They were losing. Heroes were falling. Evil was winning. Just like it always did, eventually. No, Steve said out loud, rejecting the thought. No, we've lost battles before, lost friends before. We grieve, we rage, and then we keep fighting. Because that's what heroes do. We don't win because we're guaranteed victory. We win because we refuse to accept defeat. He activated his emergency beacon, calling for backup from any available Avenger. This anchor needed to be broken now, before Nurgle's whispers infected him completely, before acceptance replaced determination, before entropy's peace drowned out the defiant roar of human will. Father Reyes tilted his head, flies buzzing louder. Admirable, foolish, but admirable. Very well, if you will not embrace peace, then embrace plague. The priest's body burst open like overripe fruit, revealing the demonic form growing within. This was no longer even remotely human. This was Nurgle's rot-given flesh, a great unclean one manifesting through the priest's willing sacrifice. And Steve Rogers, armed with only a shield and the conviction that giving up was never an option, charged forward to fight a demon from another universe with nothing but human determination and superhuman stubbornness. 1 anchor weakened, 2 active, 1 regenerating, and 39 hours until Exitar arrived to judge. In the space between dimensions, far from mortal perception, the Chaos Gods convened in a realm that existed outside conventional reality. Here, they were not diminished by the absence of the warp. Here, they were absolute. 4 vast consciousnesses discussing strategy with the weight of millions of years behind their thoughts. The Marvel Universe resists more effectively than calculated, Tzeentch observed, his essence swirling through 9 dimensions simultaneously. Their heroes demonstrate adaptability beyond baseline mortal parameters. The Asgardian refused combat. The futurist self-terminated his technology. The soldier converts despair into motivation. They are strong, Khorne acknowledged with something resembling respect. Worthy opponents. This makes their eventual corruption more valuable. Breaking the unbreakable feeds me more than consuming the weak. But we are running out of time, Nurgle added, his voice patient but concerned. The executioner comes. Even we cannot manifest fully before his arrival. And if he sterilizes this planet, we lose all 4 anchors simultaneously. Then we accelerate, Slaanesh purred. No more subtlety, no more patience. We have 1 anchor fully secured. The Black Widow has become ours completely. We use her as the primary conduit and pour everything through that single point. Abandoning the other anchors? Khorne's tone suggested displeasure. Consolidating, Tzeentch corrected. 3 damaged anchors provide less power than 1 perfect anchor. We retreat, regroup, and manifest through the New York venue with full force. Then, from a position of strength, we expand. The 4 consciousnesses reached consensus, a rare occurrence that sent ripples across dimensional barriers. In Geneva, the whispers in Weiss's mind went silent. In Mumbai, Reyes's demonic transformation halted mid-manifestation. In Sokovia, Volkov felt Khorne's presence withdraw like a tide pulling back from shore. But in New York, in the Hauptau, underground venue that had become Slaanesh's temple, power surged like a dam breaking. 38 hours until Exitar's arrival. Dr. Strange materialized in the Avengers Tower conference room, his body held together by mystical energy and stubbornness in roughly equal measure. Blood still seeped from where his left hand had been severed. Wong's emergency teleportation had saved his life, but couldn't restore lost flesh. Around the table sat what remained of Earth's defense. Thor, still steaming from the Sokovian battlefield. Tony Stark, his chest now containing a mystical construct where his arc reactor had been, courtesy of Wong's emergency surgery. Captain America, his uniform corroded by Nurgle's plagues, but his spine still straight. Icarus representing the Eternals. Wong, exhausted but present. And on the view screen, Arishem the Judge, his massive form orbiting Earth like a 6-eyed moon. 38 hours, Strange said without preamble. That's how long we have before Exitar arrives. Current corruption percentage is 11% and rising. At 13%, Arishem has authorization to begin preliminary sterilization. At 17%, Exitar executes full planetary judgment. Sterilization, Tony said flatly. Let's be clear what that means. They'll kill everything. Every person, every animal, every microbe. Burn the planet to bedrock and start over. That's the celestial solution to contamination. Scorched Earth taken to cosmic extremes. Accurate, Arishem confirmed without emotion. Dimensional corruption of this nature requires absolute eradication. Partial measures risk metastatic spread to other realities. We're not letting that happen, Steve said, his voice carrying absolute conviction despite his exhaustion. There has to be another way. There might be, Strange said slowly, and everyone turned to face him. I've been studying these entities from every angle I can access. They're called the Ruinous Powers, Chaos Gods from a universe dominated by something called the Warp. In their native reality, they're sustained by the psychic energy of countless trillions, fed by every emotion, every thought, every soul across an entire galaxy. Thor leaned forward. But the Warp does not exist here. Exactly. They're operating on power reserves, converting our universe's emotional energy into something they can metabolize. It's inefficient, which is why they needed anchors. Stable points to channel power through. We've damaged 3 of those anchors. Strange pulled up holographic displays showing psychic topology. But they've adapted. They're consolidating everything into a single anchor, Natasha Romanoff, in the New York venue. Tony's expression went hard. You said she was gone, that there's nothing left to save. I said there's nothing left of Natasha, Strange corrected quietly. But her body still exists. And if they're pouring all their power through one anchor instead of 4, that creates a vulnerability, one single point of catastrophic failure. You want to destroy Natasha's body? Steve said, his voice carefully neutral. Kill our friend to kill their anchor. I want to save 7 billion people, Strange replied, meeting Steve's eyes. If you have another option, I'm listening, but we're out of time for sentiment. The room fell silent. Everyone understood the calculus. One life versus billions. The math was brutally simple, but the cost was anything but. There might be another way, Wang said hesitantly. The ancient texts mention a ritual, a binding that could trap the Chaos Gods inside their anchor, sealing them within a single mortal form. It wouldn't kill them, but it would prevent them from spreading. They'd be contained. For how long? Thor asked. Indefinitely, in theory. But it would require... Wang hesitated. It would require the anchor to be willing. The vessel would have to accept the binding, knowing they'd be a prison for these entities, forever. Conscious, trapped, containing 4 gods inside their mind for the rest of their existence. That's not mercy, Tony said. That's torture. You'd be condemning Natasha to eternity as a cage for the things that destroyed her. Better than condemning Earth to extinction, Strange countered. This discussion is irrelevant, Arishem interrupted. Corruption level has reached 12%. Preliminary sterilization authorized in 60 seconds. Wait, Strange called out. We have a plan. Give us until Exitar arrives. Negative. Risk of further contamination too high. Beginning atmospheric ionization sequence. Arishem raised one massive hand, and space itself began to distort around his palm. Energy gathered that would ignite Earth's atmosphere, turning the entire planetary surface into an inferno that would burn for 72 hours until every organic molecule had been reduced to constituent atoms. Thor launched himself toward the window, Mjolnir crackling. I will not allow... Wait! The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. 4 tones speaking as one, resonating through the building's structure, through the air itself, through the thoughts of everyone present. The view screen flickered, and an image appeared that made everyone in the room recoil. It was Natasha Romanoff, or something wearing her shape. Her body had been transformed. Perfected in ways that violated aesthetic sense, made beautiful through principles that had nothing to do with human beauty. Her skin shimmered with colors that didn't exist in normal spectrums. Her eyes showed depths that contained palaces of sensation. Behind her, the venue had become a cathedral to excess. Its walls living art, its floor a mosaic of crystallized pleasure pain. And through her lips, the Chaos Gods spoke. Celestial, heroes of Earth, we propose negotiation. Arishem paused, his hand still raised but not yet firing. Chaos entities are incapable of honesty. Negotiation is meaningless. You judge us by your limited experience. Tzeentch's influence dominated the voice. But we are not mindless corruption. We are consciousness, intelligence, and we understand when circumstances require compromise. Strange felt every instinct screaming that this was a trap. But with Arishem seconds from executing Earth, they didn't have the luxury of refusing to listen. What are you proposing? The Natasha thing smiled, and the expression contained 4 different types of amusement. We withdraw, Return to the spaces between dimensions. Leave your universe entirely. In exchange for what? Tony demanded. One volunteer, Slanesh purred through Natasha's lips. One willing host who will serve as our anchor, not to spread corruption, but to maintain minimal presence. A single consciousness that accepts us, allows us to observe this reality without interfering. We have tasted this universe's potential, Korn added. We wish to study it further, understand its rules. Perhaps in time, find way to coexist without consuming. We offer truth, Nurgle said gently. We are eternal. You cannot destroy us. Even if Celestials burn this planet, we return to dimensional spaces and wait. But if you give us what we ask, one host, willing, freely given, we withdraw all other corruption, restore your fallen, repair damage done. And most importantly, Tzeentch concluded, we prevent Exitar's judgment. Corruption level drops below celestial threshold. Earth survives. Humanity continues. All it costs is one volunteer. The room erupted in argument. Arishem's hand remained raised, his patience running out in measurable seconds. And through it all, Strange's mind raced through possibilities. This was a trap, obviously. The Chaos Gods were offering exactly what Earth needed, survival, in exchange for exactly what they wanted, a foothold in this reality. But the alternative was extinction. And sometimes, the only winning move was to make a deal with devils and hope you could outsmart them later. I'll do it, Strange said, cutting through the arguments. Everyone turned to stare at him. I'll be your anchor, your willing host, but I have conditions. Speak them. You restore everyone you've corrupted. You withdraw all demonic presence. You seal yourselves within my consciousness with bindings I design, mystical locks that even you can't break from inside. You become observers only, no interference with my actions or decisions. And in exchange, you get to stay in this universe, minimal presence. You learn our rules without breaking them, and maybe we find a way for consciousness from two universes to coexist without one consuming the other. The silence stretched for 3 seconds that felt like hours. Acceptable, the four voices said finally. But Stephen Strange, understand what you offer. You will carry us forever. Hear our whispers always. Feel our desires pressing at edges of your thoughts. You will be both prison and prisoner. Are you certain? Strange met the eyes of his fellow heroes. Thor's concerned, Tony's calculating, Steve's filled with respect and horror. Wong looked like he wanted to object, but understood the necessity. I'm the Sorcerer Supreme, Strange said simply. Protecting Earth from mystical threats is my responsibility. If that means becoming the threat's container, so be it. Besides, he smiled without humor, I've had worse roommates than 4 Chaos Gods. At least you're honest about being parasites. Then we accept. Celestial, observe. Through Natasha's body, the Chaos Gods began the withdrawal. Across the globe, corrupted individuals suddenly gasped as whispers went silent. In Geneva, Weiss's body returned to normal configuration. His mind his own again, though, forever changed by what it had glimpsed. In Mumbai, Reyes collapsed as demonic transformation reversed, leaving him human but haunted. In Sokovia, Volkov's brass armor cracked and fell away, revealing the broken general beneath. The corruption level plummeted. 12%, 10%, 8, 6, 4, 2. And in the Avengers Tower, Natasha Romanoff's body collapsed as 4 vast consciousnesses vacated it, flowing across dimensional barriers towards Strange's waiting mind. Sorcerer Supreme, they whispered as they entered him. Welcome to forever. The binding took 7 hours. Strange sat cross-legged in a mystical circle while Wong and other sorcerers wove seals and locks around his consciousness, creating prison layers that would contain the Chaos Gods while allowing Strange to function. It was the most delicate work any of them had ever attempted. Like building a cage inside someone's skull while they were still using their brain, Strange felt them settling in. 4 presences taking up residence in corners of his mind he'd never known existed. Korn in his anger, Tzeentch in his curiosity, Nurgle in his acceptance of mortality, Slaanesh in his desire for mastery and perfection. They were sealed, bound, contained, but they were also there, always there, whispering, watching, waiting. 37 hours after Strange accepted them, Exitar the Executioner arrived in Earth's orbit. A celestial so massive, he dwarfed even Arishem. His form designed for one purpose: extinction. His sensors swept the planet, analyzing corruption levels, preparing judgment. Contamination, 1.7%, below extinction threshold. Assessment, planet sanctioned but survivable. Monitoring status increased to maximum. Departure authorized. Exitar turned and left, his purpose unfulfilled. Earth had been judged and found wanting but not wanting enough to require sterilization. Humanity had survived, but it would never be the same. Dr. Stephen Strange, Sorcerer Supreme, sat in the Sanctum Sanctorum and felt 4 gods stirring in his mind. They had kept their word, mostly. The corruption had withdrawn. The anchors had been restored to humanity. Earth had been spared. But the Chaos Gods were still here, still watching, still learning. And in the depths of his consciousness, Tzeentch laughed softly, because this was exactly what he'd calculated from the beginning. Not conquest through force, but infiltration through acceptance. Not taking the universe by storm, but being invited inside its greatest mystical defender. "I know what you're thinking," Strange said aloud to the empty room, speaking to the gods inside his skull. "You think you've won. That being inside me gives you access to Earth's mystical knowledge, to dimensional secrets, to power you couldn't claim by force. Have we not?" Tzeentch purred. "Maybe. Or maybe I've got you exactly where I want you, contained, sealed, where I can study you every moment of every day. Learn your patterns, understand your nature, find your weaknesses." Strange smiled grimly. "You're in my house now, and I'm a very attentive host." The Chaos Gods fell silent, considering this new angle. Perhaps the Sorcerer Supreme was more dangerous than they'd calculated. Or perhaps he was simply deluding himself. Time would tell. And time was something they had infinite amounts of. Outside, reality settled into a new equilibrium. Earth had been touched by gods from another universe and survived. Heroes had been corrupted and restored. Celestials had judged and departed. But in the spaces between dimensions, other entities had noticed the breach. The breach that had let the Chaos Gods through. The breach that proved the Marvel Universe's barriers were permeable. And in countless other realities, other ancient intelligences began to wonder what other opportunities might exist in a cosmos that had just demonstrated it could be invaded. The war with the Chaos Gods was over. But the age of dimensional invasion had only just begun, 6 months after the binding. The Sanctum Sanctorum's highest tower had become Dr. Strange's prison and sanctuary in equal measure. Here, suspended between Earth and the dimensional barriers he protected, Strange maintained his vigil, keeping humanity safe from mystical threats, while simultaneously containing 4 of the most dangerous entities to ever touch this reality. The arrangement was working, mostly. "You're getting stronger," Wong observed during their weekly assessment. Mystical instruments hovering around Strange's seated form, measuring the integrity of the binding seals. The containment is holding, but your baseline power has increased by 40% since the binding. That's concerning. Strange didn't open his eyes. They're teaching me. Khorne shows me combat magics that make the crimson bands of Sidorak look like children's toys. Tzeentch whispers secrets of probability manipulation that would revolutionize dimensional mathematics. Nurgle offers understanding of entropy that could let me reverse death itself. Slaanesh demonstrates perfection in spellcraft that surpasses anything in Kamartaj's libraries. And you accept these gifts? Wong's voice carried warning. I take what I can use and reject what would corrupt me. Strange finally opened his eyes, and Wong saw they'd changed subtly. Depths there that hadn't existed before. As if Strange was looking through multiple dimensions simultaneously. The knowledge itself isn't evil, Wong. It's just knowledge. From a source we don't trust, yes, but verifiable through independent study. The sorcerer learns. Khorne's voice rumbled from somewhere deep in Strange's consciousness, audible to Wong through mystical resonance. Good. Weakness offends me. Even in our prison, we prefer our warden to be mighty. He's also clever, Tzeentch added with approval. He takes our gifts and transforms them, stripping away corruption while retaining utility. Fascinating. We've never encountered a mortal who could filter our influence so effectively. He suffers for it, Nurgle observed gently. Every night, fighting whispers. Every meditation, reinforcing seals. Exhaustion accumulates. Entropy works on him as it works on all things. And yet he persists, Slaanesh purred. Such dedication, such obsessive perfection in his duty. Delicious. He's more like us than he admits. I'm nothing like you, Strange said flatly. And Wong, yes, I'm tired. Yes, it's hard. But Earth is still standing. The Celestials haven't returned. And I've turned 4 cosmic parasites into the universe's most hostile advisory council. I'd call that a win. Wong wanted to argue, but he couldn't deny results. In 6 months, Strange had prevented 3-dimensional incursions that would have leveled cities, solved a mystical plague in Tibet that had stumped every sorcerer who'd examined it, and negotiated peace between 2 demon lords who'd been warring for millennia. His effectiveness had increased dramatically. The cost was visible in subtle ways. Strange slept less, smiled rarely, and sometimes would pause mid-conversation as if listening to voices only he could hear. But he was still himself. Still Dr. Stephen Strange, defender of reality, master of mystic arts. Just more than he had been, and possibly less. The Avengers want to know when you're coming back to active duty, Wong said, changing subjects. Thor asks about you weekly. Stark's built you 3 new mystical tech hybrid gauntlets. Even Captain America sent a message saying they miss you. Strange's expression softened fractionally. I miss them too. But I can't risk field deployment yet. Not until I'm absolutely certain the binding will hold under combat stress. One moment of lost concentration, one crack in my mental defenses, and I could become the anchor again, except this time, willingly possessed. They understand. But Stephen, you can't isolate yourself forever. Isolation makes you vulnerable in different ways. Before Strange could respond, alarms shrieked across the sanctum. Mystical wards blazed to life, detecting a massive dimensional disturbance over Manhattan. Strange was on his feet instantly, the eye of Agamotto glowing, his consciousness expanding across the city. What he sensed made his blood run cold. A portal, not to any dimension he recognized, not to the dark dimension or the mirror dimension or any of the 100 realms he monitored. This was something else entirely. A tear in reality connecting to a space that felt eerily familiar. No, Strange whispered. They wouldn't. They couldn't. But they could, Tzeentch said, and Strange could hear the smile in the architect's voice. Did you really think the breach that brought us here went unnoticed by other entities? We were merely the first to arrive, Sorcerer, not the last. Through the portal over Manhattan, something vast began to emerge. Strange's mystical senses recoiled from it, the consciousness too large, too ordered, too absolutely certain of its own righteousness. He'd felt this presence before, during the initial confrontation. A celestial, but not Arishem or Exitar. Eson the Searcher. Arishem's voice boomed across emergency mystical channels. Status report. Unauthorized dimensional breach. Eson has gone rogue. He believes Earth's exposure to chaos entities makes it viable research subject. He intends to abduct your planet for study. Strange opened a portal and stepped through, emerging over Manhattan beside Arishem's orbital form. Below, Eson the Searcher fully manifested. 2,000 feet of cosmic power and scientific curiosity wrapped in armor that predated Earth's sun. Sorcerer Supreme. Eson's voice resonated across every frequency simultaneously. Your binding of chaos entities is unprecedented. No mortal has achieved such feat. You and your planet represent valuable data. I am claiming Earth for celestial research. Resistance is illogical. Earth isn't a specimen, Strange said, his voice amplified by magic to match the Celestial's volume. We're not your experiment. Leave, now. Negative. Preliminary scans indicate your binding contains flaws. Chaos entities are influencing you more than you perceive. I calculate 73% probability of binding failure within 5 years. Earth will become corrupted. Therefore, I must study your methods now, before deterioration. Arishem moved to intercept, but Eson had prepared. Dimensional barriers snapped into place around Arishem, trapping the judge inside geometric constructs that would take hours to breach. Eson had studied Earth for months, prepared for every contingency, calculated optimal strategies. He'd made one miscalculation. He'd assumed Dr. Strange would fight alone. Portals opened across Manhattan's skyline. Thor emerged wreathed in lightning, Tony Stark in armor that incorporated mystical glyphs Strange had designed. Captain America with a shield that now bore protective enchantments. The remaining Avengers assembled and ready. But more than that, Ikaris and the Eternals, ancient defenders recognizing that one of their creators had gone rogue. The sorcerers of Kamartaj, every mystical defender Strange had trained or worked with. Even some reformed villains who decided that if Earth was going to be abducted by a cosmic entity, they'd rather it wasn't. Earth's defenders united against impossible odds. Again. You want to study my binding? Strange called up to Eson. Let me give you a demonstration. Inside this seal, I contain 4 gods, 4 vast consciousnesses that exist across dimensions, sustained by emotion itself, capable of corrupting reality through sheer will. And I hold them. Not through force, through understanding, through accepting them while refusing to become them. His hands moved through sigils, and mystical energy blazed. You want to know the secret? It's not about being stronger than what you contain. It's about being yourself so completely that nothing can displace you. Identity as armor, will as weapon, humanity as strength rather than weakness. Philosophical nonsense, Eson dismissed. Consciousness can be measured, quantified, understood through scientific... Can it? Strange smiled, and there was something dangerous in the expression, something that hadn't been there before the binding. Let's test that hypothesis. You want to study how I contain the Chaos Gods? Fine. Study this. He did something he'd sworn never to do. Something Wong had begged him never to attempt. Something the other Avengers didn't even know was possible. He opened the binding, just a fraction, just for a moment. 4 consciousnesses surged outward from Strange's mind, not to possess him, but to manifest around him. Avatars of pure concept given temporary form. They weren't fully present, weren't at full power, but they were visible, tangible, real. Khorne stood at Strange's right hand, 12 feet of brass and fury and the promise of endless war. Tzeentch coiled at his left, a crystalline impossibility that hurt to perceive directly. Nurgle manifested behind him, decay and acceptance made flesh. Slaanesh drifted above, beauty and horror in perfect synthesis. And all 4 spoke in unison through Strange's amplified voice. You wish to study us, Celestial? Very well. Come closer. Look directly into what we are. Understand the nature of consciousness that exists outside your physics, your measurements, your comprehension. See if your ordered mind can process chaos without shattering. Eson's sensors focused on the manifestations, analyzing, categorizing, attempting to understand entities that existed on principles his instruments weren't designed to measure. For exactly 3 seconds, the Celestial's processing power dedicated itself entirely to comprehending the impossible. And in those 3 seconds, the Chaos Gods whispered to him. Not corrupting, they couldn't, not at this limited power, but questioning, planting seeds of doubt in a mind that had never doubted, asking a consciousness designed for absolute certainty whether certainty was truly possible, whether his measurements might be wrong, whether his understanding might be flawed, whether the universe might be bigger than celestial comprehension. Eson staggered. Not physically. Celestials didn't stumble. But his sensors flickered. His consciousness recoiled. For the first time in 4 billion years of existence, Eson the Searcher experienced something that made his purpose seem uncertain. Insufficient data, he said, and his voice carried confusion that Celestials weren't meant to feel. Analysis incomplete. Require recalibration. Strange pulled the manifestations back, sealing the binding before the exposure could spread. But the damage was done. He'd proven that there were things even Celestials couldn't measure, couldn't understand, couldn't categorize. And Eson, confronted with the limits of his comprehension, made a very celestial decision. Earth represents unknown variable of unprecedented complexity. Further study risks contaminating observational apparatus. Recommend quarantine protocol. Isolation rather than abduction. Departure authorized. The rogue Celestial turned and left, his scientific curiosity overcome by self-preservation. Earth was too dangerous to study up close. Better to observe from a safe distance. Arishem broke free of his dimensional prison as Eson departed. Unprecedented. Chaos entities used as weapon rather than threat. Sorcerer Supreme, you walk dangerous path. I'm aware, Strange said, exhaustion hitting him like a physical force as the binding resealed completely. But it worked. Earth is still here. The Celestials are leaving. And I'm still myself. For now, Arishem said, and his tone suggested this conversation would continue. But I will be watching. And if your binding fails, if chaos corruption spreads despite your precautions, Exidar will return, and next time there will be no negotiation. The Celestial vanished, leaving Earth's defenders floating in the sky above Manhattan, processing what had just happened. Thor landed beside Strange, concern evident. My friend, what you just did, That was dangerous beyond measure. Are you yourself? Strange managed a tired smile. Still me, Thor. Still fighting. Still refusing to let cosmic horrors win. Though I'll admit, having 4 of them as roommates makes things complicated. You need rest, Captain America said, approaching with the others. And probably therapy, possibly divine intervention, definitely a vacation. Can't, Strange said. The moment I relax, they push. The moment I sleep, they whisper. This is my life now. Constant vigil, eternal warden, humanity's last line of defense against invasion from within. He exaggerates, Tzeentch said, his voice audible to the assembled heroes through Strange's mystical projection. We're not that bad. We even help occasionally. When it serves our interests, Korn added honestly. Which increasingly align with Earth's survival, Nurgle observed. Since we're rather stuck here. Trapped in the mind of a perpetually stressed sorcerer. Slaanesh sighed dramatically. It's not the transcendent experience we'd hoped for, but one adapts. Tony Stark stared at Strange, then at the space where the Chaos Gods' voices emanated from. So, you've got 4 evil gods living in your head? They occasionally give you advice, and you just use them to scare off a Celestial. That's somehow both the most horrifying and most badass thing I've ever witnessed. Welcome to my life, Strange said. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have 17 dimensional barriers to reinforce, 34 mystical threats to monitor, and 4 cosmic entities to keep contained. Just another day defending reality. He opened a portal back to the sanctum, then paused. Thank you, all of you, for coming when I needed backup, for trusting me despite... He gestured vaguely at his head. Despite everything. We're Avengers, Steve said simply. We don't leave our people behind, even when they're volunteering to be prisons for gods, especially then. Strange nodded, emotion flickering across his exhausted features, then stepped through the portal. It closed behind him, leaving Earth's defenders standing in the Manhattan sky, processing the implications of what they'd just witnessed. So, Tony said eventually, anyone else think we should probably have a backup plan for when Strange's binding inevitably fails and he becomes possessed by 4 dimension-hopping nightmare gods? Already working on it, Wong said, appearing through his own portal. Multiple contingencies, none of them pleasant. Good, Thor said, because I have seen what those entities are capable of, even at diminished power. If they ever manifest fully in our universe, through strange or any other means, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They all understood. The Chaos Gods had been defeated through negotiation and containment, not destruction. They were still here, still dangerous, still waiting for any opportunity to spread. And Dr. Strange stood between them and Earth, one man against 4 gods, his will the only barrier preventing dimensional catastrophe. It was, everyone silently acknowledged, possibly the most important and most thankless job in the universe. Somewhere in the spaces between realities, in dimensions that existed adjacent to the Marvel Universe, other entities watched and learned. The barriers had been proven permeable. The Chaos Gods had established presence, however minimal. Celestials had come and gone, leaving Earth isolated but aware. The age of cosmic intervention had arrived. And Earth, tiny planet orbiting an unremarkable star, had become a nexus. A place where dimensions touched, where gods could manifest, where the impossible became routine. Humanity had survived this incursion, but it wouldn't be the last. The multiverse was vast, and it had noticed Earth. The Chaos Gods had entered the Marvel Universe expecting conquest. Swift, overwhelming, inevitable. They were entities that had broken civilizations spanning galaxies, corrupted species into extinction, waged war across millions of years. They were fundamental forces of nature made conscious, gods sustained by the darkest aspects of mortal existence. They had underestimated Earth, not because humanity was more powerful. Individually, humans were fragile, short-lived, limited. But collectively, when threatened with extinction, they demonstrated something the Chaos Gods had never encountered in the Warhammer universe. The ability to adapt rapidly, to unite across philosophical divides, to choose principles over survival when necessary. Thor had refused to fight when combat would have fed corn. Tony Stark had destroyed his own technology rather than submit to Tzeentch's seduction. Captain America had chosen hope over despair when Nurgle offered peace through acceptance. And Doctor Strange had done the impossible, accepted corruption while refusing to become corrupted, making himself both vessel and warden. The ruinous powers remained in the Marvel Universe, sealed within Strange's consciousness, observing but not manifesting. They whispered still, offered knowledge and power, tested their prison's boundaries. But they were contained, not defeated. Gods cannot be defeated, but held in check by mortal will and mystical expertise. It was not the victory Earth's defenders had hoped for. No triumphant destruction of evil, no permanent solution. Just containment, vigilance, and the knowledge that Doctor Strange would bear this burden for the rest of his life, however long that might be. But it was enough. Earth survived. Humanity continued. The Celestials departed, their judgment postponed, if not eliminated. And in the process, the Marvel Universe learned a crucial lesson. The barriers between realities were not as absolute as once believed. The Chaos Gods were the first to breach those barriers. They would not be the last. In the years to come, other entities would notice Earth's accessibility. Other dimensions would reach toward this reality where heroes fought gods and sometimes won. The universe had expanded in ways that made conventional cosmic threats seem almost quaint. And at the center of it all stood Dr. Stephen Strange, Sorcerer Supreme, defender of dimensional barriers, prison for gods. He had given up peace, comfort, and possibly his sanity to save his world. Some called him hero, others called him martyr. He called himself what he'd always been, a man who'd taken an oath to do no harm, then discovered that sometimes the only way to prevent harm was to absorb it yourself. The Chaos Gods whispered in his mind, eternal companions in solitude. But Strange had learned to hear them without listening, to acknowledge them without obeying, to carry darkness while walking in light. It was not the ending anyone would have chosen, but it was the ending Earth needed. And in a universe of infinite possibilities, sometimes survival was victory enough.